Before we begin tonight's journey into the forgotten corners of the American frontier, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, settle into your blankets, and let the weight of the day slip away. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time when justice wore no badge, when the line between hunter and hunted blurred in the desert heat, and when fear had a name that whispered through saloon doors and echoed across empty plains. This is the story of why bounty hunters were the most feared figures in the Wild West, and I promise you, by the end of this tale, you'll understand why even the most hardened outlaws would rather face a hanging judge than hear those dreaded words, "I'm here for the reward." The year was 1873, and the American West was a sprawling, lawless expanse where civilization clung to the edges of towns like morning dew on sagebrush. In a dusty settlement called Copper Ridge, nestled between the Arizona Territory and New Mexico, there lived a man who would come to embody everything terrifying about the bounty hunting profession. His name was Elijah Blackwood, though most folks just called him Black. Not because of any physical characteristic, but because of the darkness that seemed to follow him wherever he rode. Black wasn't born into the bounty hunting trade. No, his story began much quieter, much more ordinary. He'd been a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania, can you believe that? A man who once taught children their letters and numbers, who read poetry by candlelight and believed in the fundamental goodness of human nature. But the West had a way of changing people, of stripping away their civilized veneer and revealing what lay beneath. For Elijah Blackwood, that transformation came on a cold November night in 1868, when everything he knew about the world burned to ash. His wife Mary and their 2 young daughters had been traveling by wagon to meet him in Colorado, where he'd secured a position at a new schoolhouse. They never arrived. A gang of outlaws, led by a man named Silas Drummond, had attacked their wagon train. The details of what happened that night were sparse, pieced together from the testimony of a single survivor who'd hidden beneath a dead horse for 6 hours. But the end result was clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. Mary and the girls were gone, and Elijah Blackwood, the school teacher, died with them. What emerged from that tragedy was something else entirely. Black spent 3 months tracking Silas Drummond's gang across 4 territories. He learned to read sign like a Comanche scout, learned to shoot like a cavalry marksman, learned to survive on nothing but rainwater and determination. When he finally caught up to them outside of Dodge City, he didn't wait for the law. He walked into their camp at midnight, 2 pistols in his hands and a rope over his shoulder. By dawn, 6 men hung from a cottonwood tree, and Silas Drummond's body was draped over a horse, being led into town to collect the $2,000 reward that had been on his head. Now you might be thinking that's where Black's story ends, that he got his revenge and went back to teaching. But revenge is a peculiar thing. It doesn't fill the hole it promises to fill. It just shows you how deep that hole really goes. Black discovered he had a talent for hunting men, and in the Wild West of the 1870s, that talent was worth its weight in gold. More importantly, he discovered that he didn't feel anything anymore. Not fear, not hesitation, not mercy. And that absence of feeling made him the most dangerous kind of hunter. Before we continue deeper into Black's world and the brutal reality of bounty hunting, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're finding this story pulling you into that perfect state between waking and dreaming, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We share stories like this every week, designed specifically to guide you into peaceful sleep while feeding your curiosity about history's forgotten corners. And if you're enjoying this tale, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and your thoughts help shape the stories we tell. Now, let's return to Copper Ridge and the world that Black inhabited. The town of Copper Ridge was typical of frontier settlements in that era. A main street of packed dirt, flanked by wooden buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. There was a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Henshaw, a saloon called the Lucky Dollar where miners spent their wages and their hopes, a stable owned by a former Confederate soldier who never gave his real name, and a sheriff's office that stood empty more often than not. The position of sheriff in Copper Ridge changed hands roughly every 6 months, usually when the current holder of the badge got tired of the job's hazards and rode off in the night, or got planted in the cemetery on the hill. Into this world, Black arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, riding a steel-grey mare that looked as tired as the desert itself. He tied his horse outside the Lucky Dollar and walked inside, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden floor. The saloon went quiet the way saloons always did when a stranger entered, especially a stranger who wore 2 guns and had eyes that looked through you rather than at you. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a scar running from his ear to his chin, wiped down the bar with a rag that had seen cleaner days. Black ordered whiskey and unfolded a piece of paper on the bar. It was a wanted poster, creased and worn from being carried in his saddlebag. The face staring out from the poster belonged to a man named Coleman Reeves, wanted for robbery, murder, and arson across 3 territories. The reward was $5,000, a fortune in those days. The bartender glanced at the poster and his face went pale. "You law?" the bartender asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm whoever brings Reeves in," Black replied, his voice flat as Kansas prairie. "Heard he was seen in these parts." The bartender's hand trembled slightly as he poured the whiskey. "Ain't seen nobody matching that description," he said, a little too quickly. "We're peaceful folk here, don't want no trouble." Black sipped his whiskey, letting the silence stretch out like taffy. This was a technique he'd perfected over the years. People couldn't stand silence. They'd fill it with words, and those words would eventually include the truth, whether they meant to tell it or not. He waited. A voice came from the corner of the saloon, where a card game had been in progress before Black entered. "Coleman Reeves rode through here about a week ago," the voice said. It belonged to an older man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen too much. Bought supplies and headed north toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Had 3 men with him. Black turned to look at the man, studying him the way a jeweler studies a stone. "You're sure it was Reeves?" "I'm sure," the old man said. "I rode with his brother back in '62. Family resemblance is strong. He's holed up in an old Spanish mission ruins about 30 miles north, a place called San Miguel del Vardo." "Why are you telling me this?" Black asked, and it was a fair question. In the West, informing on outlaws was a good way to end up dead in a ditch. The old man's face hardened. "Because Coleman Reeves killed my grandson last year in Santa Fe. Boy was just 15, working as a stable hand. Reeves shot him for fun because he didn't like the way the boy looked at him. So yeah, I'll tell you where he is, and I'll sleep better knowing you're going after him." Black finished his whiskey and dropped a silver dollar on the bar. "Much obliged," he said, and walked out into the afternoon sun. This is how bounty hunting worked in those days. It wasn't like you see in the movies, with organized posses and telegraphs and coordination. It was lonely, dangerous work that required a specific kind of madness. You had to be willing to ride into situations where the odds were stacked against you, where you might be walking into a trap, where every shadow could hide a gun barrel. And you had to be cold enough, hard enough, to do whatever was necessary to bring your target in. Dead or alive, the posters always said, and they meant it. In fact, most bounty hunters preferred dead. Dead men don't escape, don't testify against you if things went sideways, and most importantly, don't require feeding during the long ride back to civilization. The ride north toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains took Black 2 days. He traveled slowly, carefully, reading the land the way a scholar reads a book. Every broken branch, every disturbed stone, every place where grass had been pressed down by a sleeping body told him something. By the time he reached the foothills, he knew he was on the right track. He could see the signs of 4 horses, one of them carrying a heavier load than the others, probably supplies. They weren't trying too hard to hide their trail, which meant either they were arrogant or they didn't think anyone was following. Both possibilities worked in Black's favor. The ruins of San Miguel del Vardo sat in a valley between 2 ridges, the adobe walls crumbling but still providing shelter from the wind and sun. It had been a mission once back when the Spanish ruled this territory, a place where priests tried to bring Christianity to the native peoples. Now it was just another forgotten monument to empires that had come and gone. Black found a vantage point on the eastern ridge, hidden among a cluster of rocks and juniper bushes, and settled in to watch. This was another aspect of bounty hunting that separated the successful from the dead. Patience. Black could wait for days if necessary, barely moving, eating dried beef and hardtack, watching through a telescope he'd bought in Denver. He watched the mission ruins through the rest of that day and into the night, mapping out the routines of the men below. Coleman Reeves and his 3 companions had made themselves comfortable. They'd built a fire in what had once been the mission's courtyard, and Black could see them passing a bottle back and forth, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. One of them stood guard while the others slept, but the guard wasn't particularly attentive. He spent most of his time sitting against a wall, smoking cigarettes and occasionally getting up to stretch his legs. This was the weakness Black had been looking for, overconfidence. They'd been here a week without trouble, and they were starting to believe they were safe. Black waited until the darkest part of the night, that hour before dawn when sleep is deepest and the human body is at its lowest ebb. He moved down from the ridge like a ghost, his feet finding quiet places among the rocks and brush. He'd learned this kind of movement from spending time with Apache scouts, how to distribute your weight, how to sense the ground before committing to a step, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. The guard was dozing, his rifle propped against the wall beside him. Black could have killed him silently, probably should have by the cold logic of the hunt. But Black had rules, strange as that might sound. He didn't kill unless he had to. He'd done enough killing for revenge. Now he killed only when there was no other choice. He struck the guard across the back of the head with the butt of his pistol, a calculated blow that dropped the man without making a sound. Now came the hard part. Coleman Reeves and his two remaining men were sleeping in what had once been the mission's chapel, a roofless space with walls that still stood mostly intact. Black could see them clearly in the dying light of their campfire, three shapes wrapped in blankets, their weapons nearby but not in their hands. He could rush in, guns blazing, but that was likely to end with everyone dead, including himself. These weren't schoolchildren or farmers. They were hardened criminals who'd survived this long by being quick and mean. Instead, Black did something that would become his signature move, the thing that would make his reputation spread across the frontier like wildfire. He waited until he was sure they were deeply asleep, then he carefully, methodically, gathered their weapons. The rifles leaning against the wall, the pistols in their holsters, even the knife stuck in a piece of wood near their fire. He collected them all and moved them to the far side of the courtyard, stacking them carefully. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee from their pot, sat down on a chunk of broken wall, and waited for sunrise. When Coleman Reeves woke up, the first thing he saw was Black sitting there, casual as Sunday morning, sipping coffee and watching them with those empty eyes. Reeves reached for his gun, found nothing, then looked around wildly. His two companions were stirring now, going through the same confused realization. "Morning, gentlemen," Black said, his voice conversational. "Coffee's pretty good. You boys know how to brew a decent cup." "Who the hell are you?" Reeves demanded, though something in his face suggested he was starting to figure it out. "Name's Blackwood, but I suspect you've heard of me. Folks call me Black." He paused to take another sip of coffee. "I'm here for you, Coleman. There's $5,000 on your head, and I aim to collect it." One of Reeves' men, a young guy with a scar across his nose, started to get up. Black's hand moved to his pistol, not drawing it, just resting on the grip. The movement was small, but somehow communicated volumes. The young man settled back down. "You're one man," Reeves said, finding some of his confidence. "Even if you got our guns, which I'm mighty curious how you managed that, you still got to get us back to civilization. That's a long ride. Lot can happen." "That's true," Black acknowledged, "which is why we're going to have a conversation about how this is going to work. See, I'm offering you boys a choice. You can come with me peaceable, we make the ride back to Santa Fe nice and easy, and I turn you over to the law-breathing. Or we can do this the hard way, and I deliver bodies draped over horses. The reward's the same either way. I don't have a preference, but I suspect you might." Now, this is where the story gets interesting, where it reveals something about the nature of fear and power in the Old West. You might think that being unarmed and outnumbered would make Reeves cooperative, but criminals like Coleman Reeves didn't get to their position by being reasonable men. They got there by being willing to do things others wouldn't, by being meaner and more ruthless than whoever stood against them. Reeves had killed 17 men that authorities knew about, probably more they didn't. He'd robbed trains, banks, and payroll wagons. He'd burned down a family home with people still inside. This wasn't a man who was going to go quietly. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," Reeves said, standing up slowly. "You're going to walk away, leave our weapons where they are, and ride out of here. Because if you don't, my associates in Santa Fe are going to hear about this, and they're going to come looking for you. And they won't be as merciful as I'm being right now." Black finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully on the wall beside him. "Coleman, I'm going to be straight with you. I've been doing this work for 5 years now. In that time, I've brought in 42 men. 31 of them came in breathing. 11 didn't. I don't lose sleep over either number. What you need to understand is that I didn't ride 2 days into these mountains to leave empty-handed. So we're past the point of negotiation. The only question is whether you're worth more to me alive or dead." There was something in the way Black said it, flat and factual, that finally broke through Reeves' bravado. This wasn't a lawman trying to uphold justice. This wasn't a rival criminal trying to prove something. This was a man who looked at him and saw a transaction, a commodity, nothing more, and somehow that was more frightening than any threat or bluster. Before we continue with what happened next in that ruined mission, I want to take a moment to remind you that if you're enjoying this deep dive into the brutal realities of frontier justice, there's so much more where this came from. Hit that like button if this story is helping you drift off, and make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. We're building a community of history lovers who appreciate the forgotten stories that textbooks leave out. Now, let's see how Black managed to transport 3 dangerous criminals across 30 miles of wilderness. The solution Black came up with was elegant in its simplicity, though brutal in its execution. He had the 3 men stripped down to their long underwear and boots, then he used their own rope to bind them together in a line, like a chain gang. The young one with the scarred nose went first, then one of the others, then Coleman Reeves at the back. Black tied the rope so that they had about 6 feet between them, enough to walk comfortably, but not enough to coordinate an attack. Their clothes he rolled up and tied to his horse. Their weapons he loaded onto the outlaws' horses, which he now controlled. Then they started walking. Black rode behind them on his grey mare, his rifle across his saddle, watching. Every few hours he'd let them rest for 15 minutes, give them water, let them sit in whatever shade they could find. but he never untied them, never let his attention waver, never gave them an opportunity. The walk back to Copper Ridge took 4 days instead of 2. Walking men, especially bound men in their underwear, don't move as fast as a rider. They developed blisters, sunburn, cuts on their feet from stones. The young one complained constantly the first day, until Reeves told him to shut up. After that, they mostly walked in silence, saving their energy. Black used this time to think, which was something he'd gotten good at during these long transports. He thought about the strange career he'd fallen into, about how he'd become someone who measured human life in dollars and cents. He thought about Mary and the girls, though less now than he used to. The sharp edge of that grief had worn down to a dull ache, like an old injury that only hurt when it rained. He thought about what he'd become and whether there was any going back. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they made camp in a box canyon that offered good protection, Coleman Reeves finally spoke to him. "You ever wonder if what you're doing is right?" he asked. Black was checking the rope that bound them to a sturdy mesquite tree. "Right's got nothing to do with it," he said. "You broke laws, there's consequences. I'm just the mechanism that delivers those consequences." "Yeah, but you choose to be that mechanism," Reeves pressed. "Nobody's forcing you to hunt men for money. That's a choice you make every morning you wake up." Black sat down with his back against a rock, his rifle in his lap. "I could say the same to you. Nobody forced you to rob and kill. Nobody forced you to shoot that stable boy in Santa Fe." "That's different," Reeves said. "I'm just taking what I want from a world that never gave me nothing. You're pretending to be righteous about it." "I'm not pretending anything," Black replied. "I know what I am. Question is, do you know what you are?" They fell silent after that. Black made a small fire, cooked some beans and salt pork, gave each of the prisoners their share. He ate his own portion slowly, mechanically, tasting nothing. When full dark came, he rolled himself in his blanket but didn't sleep. He never fully slept on these transports. He trained himself to doze lightly, to come awake at any unusual sound or movement. Around midnight, the young one with the scarred nose made his move. Black had been expecting it. Young criminals always thought they were smarter than they were, thought they'd spotted some opportunity that their captor had missed. The kid had been working on the knot that bound his hands behind his back, probably using a sharp rock he'd picked up during one of their rest stops. He'd gotten himself partially free and was trying to slip out of the rope when Black's voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't," Black said quietly. The kid froze. In the moonlight, Black could see the fear on his face, the realization that he'd been watched the entire time. "Get back in position," Black said, "and drop whatever you've got in your hand." The kid complied, a small sharp stone clinking against the ground. Black got up, checked all 3 prisoners' bonds, tightened them where needed. Then he sat back down against his rock. "Get some sleep," he told them. "We've got a long walk tomorrow." They reached Copper Ridge on the afternoon of the 4th day. Word had spread somehow, the way it always did in frontier towns, and people lined the main street to watch as Black rode in with his 3 prisoners stumbling along behind him, sunburned and exhausted, still in their long underwear. Children pointed and laughed. Women turned away or stared with horrified fascination. Men nodded with grim satisfaction. Black took them straight to the sheriff's office, where a telegram was sent to Santa Fe confirming the identity of Coleman Reeves. The reward money would take a few weeks to arrive, but Black was patient. He had the prisoners locked up, gave their clothes back to them, and then he did something that surprised everyone. He paid for a doctor to come check them over, to treat their blisters and sunburn. When the bartender at the Lucky Dollar asked him why, Black just shrugged. "They're worth $5,000 alive," he said. "Want to make sure they make it to trial." But there was something else there, something Black didn't say. Despite everything he'd become, despite the hardness he'd cultivated, there was still some small part of the schoolteacher left inside. Some small part that believed in due process, in letting the law handle what came next. It was a thin thread connecting him to his past, and he held onto it even though he wasn't sure why. The story of how Black brought in Coleman Reeves spread across the frontier like wind through dry grass. It wasn't just that he'd done it, it was how he'd done it. The patience, the planning, the cold efficiency. Other bounty hunters worked in groups, relied on ambushes and gunfights. Black worked alone and rarely fired a shot. He was methodical where others were reckless, calculating where others were emotional. And that methodical approach, that absence of anything resembling mercy or doubt, made him terrifying. Within a year, outlaws across 3 territories knew the name Blackwood. They knew that if he was hunting you, he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't make mistakes. He wouldn't listen to bribes or threats. He would simply keep coming, patient as death itself, until he had you. Some criminals, when they heard Black was on their trail, turned themselves into regular law enforcement, preferring to take their chances with a judge rather than face him. Now you might be thinking this makes Black sound like a hero, some kind of frontier justice warrior, but that would be missing the point of who and what he'd become. Heroes have noble motivations, have lines they won't cross. Black had no lines anymore. He'd seen too much, lost too much, changed too completely. He was a tool, a mechanism, a force of nature. And in the lawless chaos of the Wild West, that made him something far more dangerous than any hero or villain. Let me tell you about another hunt, one that happened about a year after the Coleman Reeves capture. This one would cement Black's reputation and reveal just how far he was willing to go in pursuit of his prey. The target was a woman named Catherine Drake, though she went by half a dozen aliases. She was wanted for running a counterfeit operation out of Denver that had flooded the territory with fake bills, destabilizing the local economy and causing several banks to fail. The reward was $10,000, the highest Black had ever pursued. Catherine Drake was 42 years old, educated, sophisticated, and absolutely ruthless. She'd grown up in Boston, the daughter of a printer, and had learned the trade from her father before moving west and applying those skills to less legal endeavors. She had connections throughout the criminal underworld, informants in law enforcement, and enough money to buy her way out of most problems. When Black started tracking her, she'd already evaded capture 3 times by bribing officials or simply disappearing before anyone could get close. Black picked up her trail in Pueblo, Colorado, where one of her associates had been arrested trying to pass a counterfeit $50 bill. The associate, facing 20 years in prison, was willing to talk. He told Black that Catherine was planning to flee to San Francisco, where she had contacts who could get her on a ship to China. She was traveling with 2 bodyguards, both former Pinkerton detectives who'd gone bad, and she was moving fast. The chase that followed lasted 3 months and covered over 1,000 miles. Black tracked them through Colorado into Utah across Nevada. Several times he came close, arriving in a town just hours after they'd left. Catherine was good, better than most criminals he'd pursued. She varied her routes, used false names, paid cash for everything so there was no paper trail. But she made one mistake, the mistake that everyone eventually made. She established a pattern. Black noticed that every 10 days or so, Catherine would stop at a town with a telegraph office and send a wire to an address in San Francisco. She was probably updating her contacts there, letting them know she was still coming. Once Black identified this pattern, the rest became a mathematical problem. He calculated her route, figured out which towns she'd likely stop at, and positioned himself ahead of her instead of chasing behind. He was waiting in a town called Silver Creek, Nevada, sitting in a restaurant across from the telegraph office when Catherine Drake walked in. She was dressed expensively, looked every inch the respectable lady, her 2 bodyguards flanking her like shadows. Black watched her send her telegram, pay the operator, and walk back out. Then he stood up, left money for his coffee, and followed. This is where things got complicated. Black couldn't just walk up and arrest her in the middle of town. The bodyguards were armed and alert. And Catherine undoubtedly had a pistol of her own hidden in that fancy dress. A shootout in broad daylight would likely end with innocent people getting hurt, something Black tried to avoid. So he did what he always did. He watched and waited. They were staying at the Silver Creek Hotel, the nicest place in town. Black rented a room on the same floor down the hall. That night he sat in a chair by his door, listening to the sounds of the hotel settling, mapping out the rhythms of the building. He heard Catherine and her guards return from dinner around 9 o'clock, heard them moving around in their rooms, heard one of the guards walk down the hall around 10 to use the privy, heard everything go quiet around 11. Black waited until 2 in the morning, that dead zone when even the most vigilant guards start to lose focus. Then he moved into the hallway, quiet as smoke. Catherine's room was in the middle, with her bodyguards in the rooms on either side, protecting her but also trapping her. Black had studied the hotel's layout, knew that her room had a window facing the alley. He'd already climbed out that afternoon when the hotel was empty, just to make sure the route was feasible. He picked the lock on her door, another skill he'd acquired during his years of hunting. The room was dark, but he could see Catherine's shape in the bed, hear her steady breathing. He crossed to her in 3 silent steps and pressed his hand over her mouth while placing the cold barrel of his pistol against her temple. "Don't scream," he whispered. "Don't move, nod if you understand." She nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. "I'm Elijah Blackwood. I'm here for the reward on your head. You're going to get dressed quietly, and you're going to come with me. Your guards in the next rooms don't need to die tonight, but they will if you make noise. Nod if you understand." She nodded again. Black removed his hand from her mouth slowly, ready to clamp it back down if she tried to cry out. But Catherine Drake was smart enough to recognize when she was beaten. She got dressed in silence while Black stood by the door, listening for any sound from the adjacent rooms. When she was ready, he tied her hands in front of her with a leather cord, not tight enough to hurt but secure enough that she couldn't easily work free. They went out the window, down to the alley the way Black had scouted earlier. He had horses waiting a block away. Within 10 minutes of entering her room, they were riding out of Silver Creek, and Catherine Drake's bodyguards were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Ride back to Denver took 2 weeks. Catherine didn't complain, didn't try to escape, didn't waste energy on futile struggles. Instead, she talked. She was one of those people who couldn't stand silence, who needed to fill every moment with words. She told Black about her life, about growing up in Boston, about how her father's printing business had failed and left the family destitute, about how she'd realized that if she was going to starve, she might as well starve while trying to get rich. "You understand," she said one evening as they camped in a canyon. "You're doing the same thing I am, taking what you can from a system that doesn't care about people like us." Black was checking their supplies, making a mental inventory of what they had left. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "I'm working within the system, you're working against it." "That's a meaningless distinction," Catherine argued. "You're still profiting from human suffering. At least I'm honest about what I am." "You flooded the territory with fake money," Black said, "caused banks to fail. People lost their life savings because of you. Farmers couldn't buy seed. Families went hungry. Don't talk to me about honesty." Catherine laughed, a bitter sound. "And how many men have you killed, Blackwood? How many widows and orphans have you created? You think you're better than me because you're on the right side of some arbitrary line called the law." Black didn't answer. He'd heard variations of this argument before from other criminals he'd transporting. They all wanted to justify what they'd done, wanted to drag him down to their level. He'd stopped engaging with it years ago. He knew what he was. He didn't need Catherine Drake or anyone else to explain it to him. They reached Denver without incident, and Black collected his $10,000. It was the largest single reward he'd ever claimed. With that money, he could have retired, could have bought a ranch or a business, could have tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. Instead, he banked most of it, kept enough for supplies and expenses, and 3 days later he was riding out again on a new hunt. Because that's what bounty hunting did to you. It became your entire identity, your purpose, the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense a long time ago. Black had hunted so many men that he'd forgotten how to be anything else. The hunt was his life now, and every successful capture just led to the next target, and the next, in an endless cycle. As we continue deeper into Black's story and the world of frontier bounty hunting, I want to pause and say thank you for staying with me on this journey. If you're finding this helps you relax and drift towards sleep, please leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing from you all, and your feedback shapes the stories I tell. Now, let's explore what made bounty hunters so feared, not just by criminals, but by ordinary citizens as well. The thing you have to understand about bounty hunters in the Old West is that they existed in a legal grey area that made everyone uncomfortable. They weren't law enforcement, weren't bound by the rules and restrictions that governed sheriffs and marshals, but they had the authority to track, capture, and in many cases kill wanted criminals. This made them powerful in a way that was both necessary and deeply troubling to frontier society. Most towns tolerated bounty hunters because they filled a gap that official law enforcement couldn't. Sheriffs had jurisdictions they couldn't cross. Marshals had too much territory to cover effectively, but bounty hunters could go anywhere, cross any border, pursue their targets with single-minded focus. They were the closest thing the Wild West had to a reliable justice system, which is a pretty damning statement about how chaotic things really were. But that power came with serious problems. Bounty hunters sometimes brought in the wrong person, either through mistake or deliberate fraud. Some would beat or torture information out of people. Some would kill their targets rather than risk the dangers of transporting them alive. And some would go after people who weren't even wanted, creating false accusations to generate bounties. The profession attracted both the deeply principled and the completely amoral, and it was often hard to tell which was which until it was too late. Black fell somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. He had his rules, his lines he wouldn't cross, but those lines were drawn in places most people would find shocking. He wouldn't kill unnecessarily, but his definition of necessary was pretty broad. He wouldn't hurt innocents, but he had a narrow view of who counted as innocent. He wouldn't take a bounty he believed was false, but he wasn't too particular about investigating the charges. If someone was wanted, that was enough for him. This approach earned him respect from some quarters and hatred from others. Law enforcement generally appreciated him because he got results and didn't create additional problems. Criminals feared him, which was the whole point. But ordinary citizens often looked at him with suspicion, seeing in him a reflection of the violence and chaos they were trying to escape by building civilization in the wilderness. There was an incident in Albuquerque that illustrated this tension perfectly. Black had tracked a horse thief named Jimmy Dalton to a boarding house in town. Dalton wasn't particularly dangerous, just a kid really barely 20 years old, who'd stolen a horse from a ranch because he was tired of walking. The reward was only $200, barely worth Black's time, but he'd been in the area and needed some pocket money. Black went to the boarding house and knocked on Dalton's door. The kid answered, saw who was standing there, and tried to slam the door shut. Black put his boot in the way and pushed the door open. Dalton backed up, hands raised, looking terrified. I didn't mean nothing by it, Dalton said, his voice cracking. I was just tired of walking. I was gonna return the horse, I swear. That's between you and the judge, Black said. Turn around, hands behind your back. As Black was binding Dalton's hands, the kid's landlady came up the stairs, a large woman with a rolling pin in her hand and outrage in her eyes. What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing? She demanded. Collecting a bounty, Black said calmly, finishing the knot. This man is wanted for horse theft. He's just a boy, the landlady protested, and he's been a perfect gentleman the whole time he's stayed here, paid his rent on time, kept his room clean, never caused a lick of trouble. That may be, Black acknowledged, but he stole a horse and there's a warrant out for his arrest. I'm just doing my job. Your job, the landlady spat the words like they tasted bad. You call this a job, hunting people down like animals for money? You're no better than a vulture picking at corpses. Black didn't respond. He'd heard worse. He guided Dalton toward the stairs, but the landlady blocked his path, rolling pin raised like a weapon. Mrs. Henderson, Dalton said quietly, it's all right, he's right. I did steal that horse. I got to face what I'd done. The landlady's face softened as she looked at the young man. Then it hardened again as she turned back to Black. You got a cold heart, mister. One day that coldness is going to freeze you solid, and nobody's going to mourn you. Black met her eyes steadily. Yes, ma'am, he said. I expect you're right about that. He took Dalton to the sheriff's office, collected his $200, and rode out of Albuquerque the next morning. But the landlady's words stayed with him, circling in his mind like buzzards over a dying animal. He wondered sometimes if he'd already frozen solid, if what people saw when they looked at him was just an animated corpse, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. The years rolled on like tumbleweeds across the desert. 1876 became 1877, then 78. Black brought in more outlaws, earned more money, built a reputation that grew larger with each successful hunt. Stories about him spread and mutated in the telling until it was hard to separate fact from legend. Some said he could track a man across solid rock. Others claimed he could go a week without sleep, that he could see in the dark like a cat, that he'd once brought in 5 men at once, all tied together like a string of fish. Most of these stories were exaggerations, but Black didn't bother correcting them. The more fearsome his reputation, the easier his job became. Criminals would sometimes surrender at the mention of his name, saving everyone the trouble of a chase. And the exaggerations weren't that far from the truth anyway. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read sign and predict human behavior. He could function on very little sleep. And he had once brought in 4 men simultaneously, though not 5. During this time, Black encountered other bounty hunters, men and women who'd taken up the same profession for their own reasons. Some he respected, recognizing a similar dedication to the craft. Others he despised, seeing in them only greed and cruelty without even the thin veneer of purpose that Black maintained. There was one hunter in particular who embodied everything wrong with the profession, a man named Lucius Gant. Gant was a big man, well over 6 feet tall and built like a bull. He'd been a slaver before the war, and when that occupation became illegal, he'd simply transferred those same skills to bounty hunting. He saw his targets as less than human, treated them with casual brutality, and didn't much care whether he brought in the right person as long as somebody paid him. He also had a habit of claiming bounties that other hunters were pursuing, using violence and intimidation to cut himself in on rewards he hadn't earned. Black first crossed paths with Gant in Santa Fe in the spring of 1878. Black had been tracking a bank robber named Samuel Cortez for 3 weeks, following his trail through New Mexico territory. He'd finally located Cortez hiding out in a small village called Chimio, working as a farmhand under an assumed name. Black was preparing to make his move when Gant showed up with 2 associates. They met outside Chimio, on a ridge overlooking the village, both studying the same small adobe house where Cortez was staying. Black noticed Gant's presence first, saw the 3 riders approaching from the east. He recognized Gant's distinctive silhouette against the sunset, that massive frame and the way he sat his horse like he owned the world. Gant reined in about 20 feet away, his associates flanking him. Well, he said, his voice a rumble like distant thunder. If it ain't the famous Blackwood. Heard you were tracking Cortez. Thought I'd come see if you needed any help. Don't need help, Black said flatly, and the bounty's mine. I tracked him here. Gant smiled, showing teeth that were stained brown from chewing tobacco. See, that's where you're wrong, friend. Cortez is wanted in 3 territories. I got just as much right to collect that reward as you do. Maury, actually, since I got here with fresh horses and men to back me up, while you're all alone as usual. The bounty's mine, Black repeated. I did the work, you just followed me here. Prove it, Gant said. and his hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. His two associates did the same. Black looked at the three men, calculating odds and options. He could draw on them, probably take out Gant before the other two got their guns clear, but probably wasn't certainly, and even if he won, he might get wounded in the process. A wounded bounty hunter was a dead bounty hunter out here, and all of this was a distraction from the real goal, which was bringing in Cortez. "Tell you what," Black said, his voice betraying none of the calculation going on behind his eyes. "We'll work together, split the reward 3 ways." Gant laughed. "3 ways? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Why would we split it equal?" "Because I know which house he's in, what name he's using, and what his daily routine is," Black said. "You don't. You can go in blind if you want, but Cortez is dangerous and smart. He'll spot you coming from a mile away and then we'll all lose him. Or you can use what I know, we take him together and we all make money. Your choice." Gant considered this, working a wad of tobacco around in his cheek. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but 2 ways, not 3. You and me, Blackwood. My boys here, they're just hired help. They get a flat fee." It wasn't ideal, but Black had learned to pick his battles. "Fine, 2 ways, but we do this my way. No unnecessary violence. We go in quiet, take him alive if possible." Sure, Gant agreed, though his tone suggested he had no intention of honoring that request. "Your way, quiet as church mice." They waited until dark, then moved down into the village. The house where Cortez was staying belonged to an elderly couple who'd taken him in as a lodger. Black had spent the last 2 days watching, learning the patterns. The old couple went to bed early, around 8 o'clock. Cortez usually stayed up later, sitting outside and smoking a pipe before turning in around 10. The plan was simple. Black would approach from the front, engaging Cortez in conversation, while Gant and his men covered the back. Once Cortez was distracted, they'd move in and take him. It should have been straightforward. But Lucius Gant didn't do straightforward. When Black approached the house, making just enough noise to alert Cortez to his presence, Gant didn't wait for the signal. He and his men burst through the back door with guns drawn, shouting and causing exactly the kind of chaos Black had hoped to avoid. Cortez, spooked, went for his own gun. Shots were fired. One of Gant's men went down with a bullet in his shoulder. The elderly couple started screaming. Black had no choice but to rush in from the front. He found Cortez in the main room, gun in hand, swinging wildly between Gant and the doorway where Black appeared. For a frozen moment, they all stood there, guns pointing in multiple directions, everyone's finger on a trigger, everyone calculating the odds of surviving what was about to happen. Then Black did something that probably saved all their lives. He lowered his gun. "Samuel," he said calmly, using Cortez's real name. "You're done. You've got 3 guns on you. You might take one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but you're not walking out of here, so let's not make this uglier than it already is." Cortez's eyes darted between Black and Gant, trying to find an angle, a way out. Finally, his shoulders sagged and he lowered his weapon. "All right," he said. "All right, I'm done." Black took Cortez's gun and bound his hands. Gant's wounded associate was bleeding but would survive. The elderly couple had retreated to their bedroom, terrified but unharmed. It could have been worse. It should have been better. Outside, as they were loading Cortez onto a horse, Black turned to Gant. "You didn't wait for my signal. You went in loud when I said quiet. Your man got shot because of it." Gant shrugged, unconcerned. "Got the job done, didn't it? That's all that matters." "No," Black said. "How you do the job matters. Those old folks in there, they're going to have nightmares for months because you came crashing through their house like a damn stampede. That man's shoulder is torn up. All of that could have been avoided." "You think too much, Blackwood," Gant said. "That's your problem. This ain't complicated. We hunt criminals, we bring them in, we collect money. Everything else is just noise." "Maybe that's your problem," Black replied. "You don't think enough." They rode to Santa Fe together, but parted ways as soon as the reward money was distributed. Black hoped he'd never have to work with Lucius Gant again, but the West wasn't that big, and bounty hunters tended to cross paths. It was inevitable they'd meet again. What Black didn't know was that the encounter had planted something in Gant's mind, a seed of resentment and jealousy. Because while they'd split the reward 50-50, the lawman in Santa Fe had thanked Black by name, had commented on his clean capture, had treated Gant like just another hired gun. That kind of slight festered in a man like Lucius Gant, grew into something ugly and dangerous. Now, if you're still with me on this journey through the darker corners of frontier justice, I hope you're finding that perfect state between wakefulness and sleep. This is exactly what these stories are designed for, to occupy your mind just enough to quiet those racing thoughts, while keeping you relaxed and comfortable. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join our community, and leave a comment telling me what you think about Black's story so far. Your engagement really helps the channel grow. Now, let's continue with what happened when these two hunters' paths crossed again. 6 months later, Black was tracking a woman named Rosa Velasquez through West Texas. Rosa was wanted for murder and stagecoach robbery, crimes she'd committed alongside her husband and 2 brothers. The husband and brothers were already dead, killed in a shootout with Texas Rangers. Rosa had escaped and gone to ground somewhere in the vast emptiness of West Texas. Black had picked up her trail outside of El Paso, where she'd stolen a horse from a livery stable. He followed her east, through country so desolate it made the usual harshness of the West look hospitable by comparison. Water was scarce, shade was non-existent, and the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. But Black was patient, methodical. He read the signs she left, predicted her movements, slowly closed the distance. He found her camped in a dry wash about 50 miles from Fort Stockton. She'd run out of water and was in bad shape, her lips cracked and bleeding, her face burned dark by the sun. When Black rode up, she didn't even reach for her gun. She just looked at him with defeated eyes and said, "Guess this is it, huh?" Black dismounted and offered her his canteen. She drank greedily, water running down her chin. "Easy," Black said. "Too much at once will make you sick." "Why do you care?" Rosa asked. "I'm just a bounty to you." "That's true," Black acknowledged, "but I care about delivering you alive and healthy enough to stand trial, so drink slowly." He made camp there in the wash, deciding to rest through the hottest part of the day and travel in the evening when it was cooler. Rosa was in no condition to cause trouble. He gave her some dried meat and hardtack, made sure she stayed hydrated, let her rest in the shade of his horse. "You married?" Rosa asked at one point. "Was," Black said. "What happened?" "She died." Rosa nodded, recognizing the tone that said the subject was closed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the wash. "I didn't mean to kill that stage driver," Rosa said eventually. "That wasn't supposed to happen. My husband, Carlos, he just wanted to rob the stage. But the driver went for his shotgun and Carlos panicked. After that, everything went to hell." "Tell it to the judge," Black said, his standard response to these kinds of confessions. "Ain't going to be no trial," Rosa said. "They'll hang me soon as we get to Fort Stockton. You know it and I know it." Black didn't respond because she was probably right. Texas justice was swift and certain, especially for someone who'd been involved in killing a stage driver. The drivers were usually well-liked, just working men trying to make a living. Their deaths were taken personally. They set out that evening as the temperature started to drop. Black had Rosa walk in front of him, hands bound but not too tightly. They made good time, stopping every few hours to rest and drink. By dawn, they were approaching the outskirts of Fort Stockton. That's when Lucius Gant appeared. He came riding out of the sunrise with his 2 associates, and Black knew immediately that this was bad. There was no legitimate reason for Gant to be here, no other bounty that would have drawn him to this particular stretch of nowhere. He'd been following Black, waiting for an opportunity. "Morning, Blackwood," Gant called out, reining his horse to a stop about 30 feet away. "Looks like you got yourself a prize there. Rosa Velasquez, if I'm not mistaken. That's a good bounty, $2,000 dead or alive." "The bounty's mine, Gant," Black said. "I tracked her, I caught her, I'm bringing her in." "Well, see, that's where we got a problem," Gant said. "Because I got a claim form right here that says I'm the one tracking Rosa Velasquez. Filed it proper and everything up in El Paso, which means legally the bounty's mine." Black felt his jaw tighten. This was a lie, had to be. Claim forms were a relatively new thing, an attempt to bring some order to the bounty hunting profession. Hunters could file a claim that they were pursuing a particular target, and if they did, other hunters were supposed to back off. But the system was easily abused, and Gant had clearly figured out how to game it. "You filed that claim after you saw me heading this direction," Black said. "You're trying to steal my bounty." "Prove it," Gant said, that same phrase he'd used before. "All I know is I got paperwork and you don't. Now I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to split this one with you 50-50, just like last time, or you can walk away empty-handed. Your choice." Rosa, standing between them, looked back and forth with growing alarm. "What's happening?" she asked. "Shut up," Gant told her. Then to Black, "What's it going to be?" Black considered his options. He could fight, try to take on Gant and his 2 men, but the odds weren't good and Rosa might get caught in the crossfire. He could try to race to Fort Stockton, but Gant's horses were fresher. He could split the bounty, but that would just encourage Gant to keep pulling this kind of scheme. Or he could do something Gant wouldn't expect. "Tell you what," Black said, "let's let the lady decide." Both Gant and Rosa looked confused. "What?" Gant said. Black turned to Rosa. "You're the bounty here. The reward says dead or alive. These men want to take you in dead because it's easier. I'm willing to take you in alive, so you choose. Who do you want to surrender to? It was a gamble, a psychological play. Black was betting that Rosa, faced with a choice between certain death and a chance at life, would choose him. And that by framing it as her choice, he'd put Gant in a position where interfering would look like simple murder rather than bounty hunting. Rosa looked at Black, then at Gant and his men. Gant was smiling that tobacco-stained smile, his hand resting on his gun. His associates looked eager, hungry. Black's face was as expressionless as always, but his gun was holstered. Him, Rosa said, nodding toward Black. I choose him. Gant's smile faded. That ain't how this works, he said. She made her choice, Black said. You want to take her from me now, you're going to have to shoot an unarmed woman in cold blood, in front of witnesses, in broad daylight, just outside a military fort. That'll look real good when you try to collect the reward. The calculation played across Gant's face. He wanted that bounty, wanted it bad, but Black was right. Shooting Rosa now would be murder, plain and simple, and even in the Wild West there were limits. The army wouldn't take kindly to someone gunning down prisoners right outside their fort. This ain't over, Blackwood, Gant said, his voice low and dangerous. One of these days, you and me are going to settle up. Looking forward to it, Black said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Gant wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Black watched them go, waiting until they were out of rifle range before letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, Rosa said quietly. Don't thank me. Black replied, you're still going to hang. I just bought you a few more days of life, that's all. They walked the rest of the way to Fort Stockton in silence. Black turned Rosa over to the military authorities, collected his reward, and spent the night in town before heading out again. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Gant had set something in motion, something that would have consequences down the line. He was right to worry. Word of the incident spread through the bounty hunting community, and it did something unexpected. It made Black look weak. Other hunters started to think that if Gant could challenge Black's claims, maybe they could too. Suddenly, Black found himself having to defend his bounties, getting into disputes with other hunters, wasting time and energy on conflicts that had nothing to do with actually catching criminals. The profession was changing, becoming more competitive, more cutthroat. In the early days, there had been an unspoken code among bounty hunters, a rough sense of honor. You did the work, you earned the reward. But as more people got into the business, attracted by the money and the freedom that code eroded, it became every man for himself, a scramble for bounties that sometimes turned violent. Black adapted because that's what he did. He started filing claim forms himself, documenting his hunts, building a paper trail. He became more cautious, more secretive about his movements. He avoided other hunters when possible and kept his plans to himself. The work became lonelier than it already was, more isolated, more paranoid. In the fall of 1879, Black took on a hunt that would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The target was a man named Jacob Thorne, wanted for a series of brutal murders in Colorado. Thorne wasn't a typical outlaw. He didn't rob banks or rustle cattle. He killed for pleasure, targeting isolated homesteads and travelers, leaving mutilated bodies in his wake. The territorial governor had put up a $10,000 reward, desperate to stop the killings. Black picked up Thorne's trail outside of Denver, following a pattern of violence that led north into Wyoming territory. Thorne was smart, careful, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. But he had a compulsion he couldn't control, and that compulsion left a trail. The hunt lasted 4 months, taking Black through some of the harshest winter weather the Rockies had to offer. He tracked Thorne through blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, following breadcrumbs of violence and death. Each crime scene revealed more about Thorne's psychology, painting a picture of a man who was as intelligent as he was disturbed. Black finally cornered Thorne in an abandoned mining camp high in the mountains. It was late February, and snow was falling so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Thorne had taken shelter in one of the old miners' shacks, not knowing that Black had been watching the camp for 2 days, waiting for exactly this moment. Black approached the shack in the pre-dawn darkness, moving through snow that came up to his knees. He'd left his horse a half-mile back, not wanting the sound of hooves to give him away. The cold was brutal, the kind that made your lungs hurt with each breath, that turned your fingers numb even inside gloves. He positioned himself outside the shack's only door and waited for sunrise. When enough light filtered through the clouds to see by, he kicked the door open and went in low, pistol drawn. Thorne was awake, had probably been awake all night. He was sitting on a rough cot, a rifle across his lap, a smile on his face. "Wondered when you'd show up," Thorne said. His voice was educated, refined, not what you'd expect from a killer living in abandoned mining camps. "You're Blackwood, aren't you? I've heard about you." Jacob Thorne, Black said, keeping his gun trained on the man's chest. You're wanted for murder in Colorado. Put the rifle down slowly. Or what? Thorne asked. You'll shoot me, please do, save everyone the trouble of a trial. There was something wrong here, something off. Black had learned to trust these instincts. Put the rifle down, he repeated. Thorne laughed. You know what's funny? I was trying to get caught. That's why I stayed here, why I left such an obvious trail. I wanted someone to find me to end this, but I wanted it to be you specifically. Know why? Black didn't answer, just kept his gun steady. Because you understand, Thorne continued. You know what it's like to have something break inside you, to become something other than human. I've read about you, Blackwood, about your wife and daughters, about what you became after they died. We're the same, you and I. We're nothing alike, Black said. No, Thorne tilted his head. I kill because something in me is broken. You hunt men for money because something in you is broken. The method's different, but the motivation is the same. We're both dead inside, just going through the motions. Put the rifle down, Black said for the third time. Thorne's smile widened. Make me. What happened next happened fast. Thorne swung the rifle up, but Black had been expecting it, had read the tension in Thorne's shoulders. Black fired once, the bullet taking Thorne in the chest. Thorne fell back against the wall, the rifle clattering to the floor. Blood spread across his shirt in a dark stain. Black approached carefully, kicked the rifle away, checked for other weapons. Thorne was still alive but fadding fast, his breath coming in wet, labored gasps. Thank you, Thorne whispered. This is better than the noose. He died 30 seconds later, his eyes still open, that strange smile still on his face. Black stood there for a long moment, looking down at the body. He thought about what Thorne had said about them being the same. He wanted to reject it completely, to draw a clear line between himself and a man who killed for pleasure. But the words had landed somewhere deep, had touched something Black usually kept buried. He wrapped Thorne's body in a tarp and loaded it onto a mule he found in the camp's stable. Then he started the long trek back to civilization, through snow and cold that seemed to seep into his bones and settle there permanently. By the time he reached Denver and collected his reward, he'd been in the mountains for nearly 5 months. He'd lost 20 pounds, had frostbite on 3 fingers, and had a cough that wouldn't go away. The doctor who examined him said he needed to rest, to take at least a month off from hunting. Black stayed in Denver for 3 days, just long enough for the worst of the frostbite to heal, then rode out again. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting questions he wasn't ready to face. The encounters with men like Gant and Thorne had started to wear on him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't the physical danger, the cold or hunger or exhaustion. It was the psychological toll, the constant confrontation with humanity's worst impulses, including his own. Black had built his identity around being the mechanism of justice, the tool that brought order to chaos. But men like Thorne forced him to ask uncomfortable questions about what separated him from the men he hunted. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, the West itself began to change. The railroad was spreading like steel veins across the landscape, connecting isolated towns and territories. Telegraph lines followed, bringing communication that had once taken weeks down to minutes. Towns were growing, becoming real cities with police forces and municipal courts. The chaotic, violent frontier that had made bounty hunters necessary was slowly, grudgingly, giving way to something more civilized. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't uniform. There were still vast stretches of wilderness where law enforcement couldn't reach, still outlaws who needed hunting. But the opportunities were shrinking, and the men who'd built their lives around bounty hunting found themselves increasingly obsolete, relics of a disappearing world. Black felt this shift acutely. In 1881, he rode into a town in Montana Territory tracking a cattle rustler, only to find that the town had hired its own permanent marshal and deputies. They'd already caught the rustler and had him locked up. The marshal, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, politely but firmly told Black that his services weren't needed. "We appreciate what you bounty hunters have done," the marshal said, "but we're trying to establish proper law enforcement now. Can't have armed civilians running around making arrests. Leads to all kinds of complications." Black rode away from that town feeling something he hadn't felt in years, purposeless. For over a decade, bounty hunting had been his entire existence. The thing that gave his life structure and meaning. Without it, what was he? He drifted for a while, taking whatever bounties he could find, but his heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. He found himself thinking about the past more, about Mary and the girls, about the schoolteacher he'd been before everything went wrong. Those memories had been locked away for so long that accessing them felt like opening a door to a stranger's life. In the spring of 1882, Black was in a saloon in Cheyenne, nursing a whiskey and studying a collection of wanted posters that were increasingly hard to come by, when a woman sat down across from him. She was in her 40s, dressed well but not ostentatiously, with intelligent eyes and a direct manner. "You're Elijah Blackwood," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" Black replied. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm a writer for Harper's Magazine. I'm doing a series of articles on the closing of the frontier, and I'd like to interview you about your experiences as a bounty hunter." Black shook his head, not interested. "I'll pay you for your time," Margaret said. "Same rate you get for a small bounty, and your story deserves to be told. You're part of history, Mr. Blackwood." "History's better off without my story," Black said, standing to leave. Margaret stood too, blocking his path. "Do you know how many men are still alive because you brought them in instead of killing them? I've been researching you for months. 31 out of 42 captured alive. That's remarkable in this profession. Most bounty hunters have the opposite ratio." Black hadn't really thought about it that way. To him, those numbers were just statistics, business decisions. Alive meant less hassle, fewer questions, cleaner paperwork. He'd never considered it from a moral perspective. "People should know that about you," Margaret continued. "They should know that even in the worst of the frontier violence, there were men who tried to do things right, who had principles." "Lady, you've got me all wrong," Black said. "I didn't bring those men in alive because of principles. I did it because it was easier." "I don't believe that," Margaret said, "and I don't think you believe it either." Something about her certainty shook him. Black sat back down. "What do you want to know?" They talked for 3 hours. Margaret asked about his methods, his motivations, the criminals he'd hunted. She asked about Mary and the girls, and Black found himself telling her things he'd never spoken aloud, emotions he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they were there. Margaret listened without judgment, taking notes in a small book, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they were done, Black felt exhausted, hollowed out. But there was also something else, something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or the beginnings of it. "Thank you," Margaret said, putting her notebook away. "This will make a powerful article. People need to understand what it was really like out here, not the romantic nonsense they read in dime novels." "When will it be published?" Black asked. "Probably in 6 months or so. I'll make sure you get a copy." Black never saw that article. By the time it was published, he was dead. Now I know that's a heavy revelation to drop, especially in a story designed to help you sleep. But sometimes the most peaceful endings come from understanding the complete arc of a life, from seeing how all the pieces fit together. Stay with me and let's explore how Black's story concluded and what it meant for the broader history of the Wild West. And if you're finding value in these deep historical narratives, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Your support keeps these stories coming. The end of Elijah Blackwood's life came not in a dramatic shootout or a grand chase, but in a dusty street in a town called Broken Bow, Nebraska, on a warm afternoon in June of 1882. And it came because of Lucius Gant, the man Black had crossed paths with years before, the man whose resentment had been festering all that time. Gant had fallen on hard times. The bounty hunting profession was drying up, and he lacked the skills or temperament to transition into regular law enforcement. He'd been drinking more, taking riskier jobs, making enemies. He blamed Black for his troubles, convinced himself that Black had somehow poisoned his reputation, turned other hunters against him. It wasn't true, but truth doesn't matter much when a man's looking for someone to hate. Gant heard that Black was in Broken Bow, waiting for a train that would take him to Kansas City. Black had finally decided to leave the frontier, to try to build some kind of life in a more settled place. He'd sold his horse, bought a new suit of clothes, even gotten a haircut. He looked more like the schoolteacher he'd once been than the bounty hunter he'd become. He was standing on the train platform, his few belongings in a carpet bag at his feet, when Gant came walking down the main street. Gant was drunk, stumbling slightly, but his gun hand was steady. "Blackwood," Gant shouted, "we got unfinished business, you and me." Black turned to face him. He'd known this confrontation was coming eventually, had known it from that first dispute over Rosa Velasquez. He could see in Gant's eyes that this wasn't going to end with words. "Don't do this, Gant," Black said quietly. "Walk away, there's nothing to gain here." "Nothing to gain," Gant laughed bitterly. "You cost me everything. My reputation, my income, my dignity. Time to pay up." A crowd was gathering, people stopping to watch the drama unfold. This was still the West, even if it was a gentler version, and a gunfight was entertainment. Black's gun was in his carpet bag. He'd packed it away because he'd thought he was done with that life, thought he was moving on. But here was the past, drunk and angry and armed, refusing to let him go. "I'm not armed," Black said, showing his empty hands. "You shoot me now, it's murder." "Then arm yourself," Gant shouted, and he pulled a pistol from his belt and threw it at Black's feet. "No excuses, draw." Black looked down at the gun lying in the dust. He could pick it up, could probably take Gant in a fair fight. Gant was drunk and sloppy, emotional. Black was sober and experienced, but something had changed in him during that conversation with Margaret Sullivan, during those 3 hours of talking about his life. He'd looked at himself clearly for the first time in years, and he didn't like what he saw. He was tired of the violence, tired of the hunting, tired of being the mechanism of other people's justice. If he picked up that gun, if he killed Lucius Gant, he'd be confirming everything he'd become, everything he'd been running from. The cycle would continue until someone faster or smarter or luckier than him put him in the ground. Black made a decision then, standing on that train platform in Broken Bow. He chose to let it end. "No," he said simply. Gant looked confused. "What do you mean, no? Pick up the damn gun." "No," Black repeated. "I'm done. You want to shoot me, go ahead, but I'm not fighting you, not anymore." The crowd murmured, uncertain. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. There were unwritten rules to frontier violence, and Black was breaking all of them. Gant's face flushed red with anger and confusion. "Pick up the gun, you coward." Black just stood there, hands at his sides, looking at Gant with something that might have been pity. "I'm not a coward, Lucius. I'm just done being what I've been. Shoot me if that's what you need to do. I won't stop you." For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a strange tableau. Gant with his gun drawn, trembling with rage and indecision. Black standing calm and still, accepting whatever came next. The crowd watching, holding their collective breath. Then a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Gant. Lower your weapon." It was the town marshal, a middle-aged man with a star on his chest and a shotgun in his hands. He'd been in his office when someone ran to tell him about the confrontation. "This ain't your business, Marshal," Gant said, not lowering his gun. "This is between me and Blackwood." "You drew a weapon on an unarmed man in my town," the marshal said. "That makes it my business. Now lower your gun or I'll put you down where you stand." Gant looked at the marshal, looked at Black, looked at the gun still lying in the dust at Black's feet. Something crumbled inside him. He lowered his gun, his shoulders sagging. "He ruined me," Gant said, and his voice was almost a whimper. "He took everything." "I didn't take anything from you, Lucius," Black said quietly. "You did that yourself." The marshal arrested Gant for disturbing the peace and threatening violence. As they led him away, Gant looked back at Black with eyes full of hatred and something else. Something that looked like broken recognition, as if he was seeing in Black a reflection of his own decline. Black picked up his carpet bag and walked to the other end of the platform. His hands were shaking, reaction setting in. He'd just faced death and chosen not to fight it, and the implications of that choice were still washing over him. The train arrived 20 minutes later. Black boarded and found a seat by the window. As the train pulled out of Broken Bow, he watched the town recede into the distance, and with it, the life he'd lived for more than a decade. He was heading toward Kansas City, toward an uncertain future, toward the possibility of becoming someone other than the ghost of Elijah Blackwood. But that future never arrived. 3 days after leaving Broken Bow, Black collapsed in his hotel room in Kansas City. The doctor who examined him found advanced tuberculosis, the kind that had been growing in his lungs for months or maybe years, aggravated by all those nights sleeping in the cold, by the frostbite and malnutrition and exposure. The cough he developed after tracking Thorne had never gone away because it was never just a cough. Black spent his last 6 weeks in a charity hospital in Kansas City, surrounded by strangers. He'd accumulated over $50,000 during his years as a bounty hunter, but he'd never trusted banks much and had kept most of it in various hiding places across the frontier. That money, scattered and hidden, was lost when he died. Margaret Sullivan visited him twice during those final weeks. She brought him an advance copy of her article, which painted a complex portrait of a man caught between civilization and chaos, between justice and vengeance. Black read it slowly, his breathing labored, and when he was done, he looked at Margaret with something that might have been gratitude. "You made me sound almost heroic," he said. "I wrote what I saw," Margaret replied. "A man who tried to maintain some humanity in an inhumane profession. That takes a kind of courage most people never need to find." "I wasn't courageous," Black said. "I was just going through motions, trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but you still chose to bring men in alive when you could have killed them. You still had rules when most bounty hunters had none. That means something." Black died on August 12, 1882 at 3 in the morning. He was alone, which seemed fitting. The hospital staff found him with his eyes closed, his face peaceful, looking more like he was sleeping than dead. They buried him in a pauper's grave, since no one came forward to claim the body or pay for anything better. The irony was not lost on those who knew his story. A man who'd earned a fortune hunting criminals, who'd been feared across 3 territories, who'd brought in some of the West's most dangerous outlaws, ended up in an unmarked grave with no one to mourn him. But Black's story doesn't really end there, because stories like his never truly end. They ripple outward, influencing the people who heard them, shaping the mythology of the West, becoming part of the larger narrative of American history. Margaret Sullivan's article about Black was widely read and frequently reprinted. It sparked a larger conversation about bounty hunters and their role in frontier justice. Some readers saw Black as a tragic figure, a good man corrupted by loss and violence. Others saw him as an example of the West's brutal pragmatism, doing what needed to be done in a time and place where conventional morality didn't always apply. The article influenced other writers and journalists who were documenting the closing of the frontier. It became a reference point for understanding how justice worked, or failed to work, in the absence of established institutions. Black's story, with all its complexity and contradictions, helped people grasp what the Wild West had actually been like, beyond the romantic legends and dime novel adventures. More immediately, Black's death had ripple effects through the bounty hunting community. The story of his final confrontation with Gant spread quickly, taking on mythical proportions in the retelling. Some said he'd been too cowardly to fight. Others said he'd been too noble, but most understood it for what it was: a man who'd finally had enough, who'd chosen to stop the cycle of violence even at the cost of his own life. Lucius Gant served 30 days in jail for the incident in Broken Bow. When he got out, he left Nebraska and drifted south into Indian Territory. He tried to continue bounty hunting, but found that the confrontation with Black had ruined what was left of his reputation. Other hunters saw him as a bully who tried to gun down an unarmed man. Eventually, he ended up working as a security guard for a railroad company, dying in 1903 from liver failure, his body worn out by decades of hard drinking. Coleman Reeves, the outlaw Black had captured in that ruined Spanish mission, was hanged in Santa Fe 3 months after his arrest. Before he died, he gave an interview to a local newspaper in which he talked about Black, calling him the most dangerous man I ever met, not because he was violent, but because he was patient. He'd wait forever if he had to, and you knew he'd never give up. Catherine Drake, the counterfeiter, served 15 years in prison and was released in 1897. She went straight, surprisingly enough, using her printing skills to start a legitimate newspaper in Oregon. She lived until 1928, and in her obituary, she mentioned being captured by the infamous bounty hunter Elijah Blackwood, one of the few public acknowledgments of his existence after his death. Young Jimmy Dalton, the horse thief, served 6 months in jail and then moved to California, where he worked as a farmhand and eventually saved enough money to buy his own small ranch. He married, had 4 children, and lived a quiet, law-abiding life until his death in 1935. He never forgot the bounty hunter who treated him with a strange kind of respect, even while bringing him to justice. Rosa Velasquez, as Black had predicted, was hanged in Fort Stockton, Texas. But before her execution, she was allowed to write letters to her family, explaining what had happened and apologizing for her crimes. Those letters survived and provided historians with insight into the human cost of frontier violence, the ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Jacob Thorne's case became infamous as one of the early examples of what we'd now call serial killing. Criminologists would later study his case, trying to understand the psychology of men like him. The fact that he'd sought out his own capture, that he'd wanted Black specifically to be the one to end his life, added a strange psychological dimension that fascinated researchers for decades. These were the people whose lives intersected with Elijah Blackwood's, whose stories became intertwined with his. But there were many others, dozens of men and women he'd tracked and captured, each with their own stories, their own reasons for ending up on wanted posters, their own reactions to being hunted by the man they called Black. If you're still awake, still following this journey through one man's life and the broader history he represents, I'm grateful. These stories matter, not because they're exciting or dramatic, but because they're real. They show us what people were actually like, how they actually lived and died, in a time and place that's often romanticized beyond recognition. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Now, let's explore what Black's story reveals about the larger phenomenon of bounty hunting in the American West. The truth about bounty hunting in the Wild West is more complicated than either its critics or its defenders would like to admit. It was a necessary institution in a place and time where official law enforcement simply couldn't reach everywhere. The West was too big, too empty, too chaotic for traditional policing to work effectively. Bounty hunters filled that gap, providing a form of justice that was rough and imperfect, but better than no justice at all. At the same time, the system was easily abused. Bounty hunters operated with minimal oversight, and while men like Black tried to maintain some standards, others were little better than the criminals they hunted. There were documented cases of bounty hunters killing innocent people, either through mistaken identity or deliberate fraud. There were cases of excessive violence, of torture, of hunters who seemed to enjoy the suffering they caused. The profession attracted a wide range of people, from ex-lawmen and former soldiers to criminals looking for a legal way to continue their violent lifestyles. Some saw it as a calling, a way to bring order to chaos. Others saw it purely as a business, a way to make money in a frontier economy with limited opportunities. And some, like Black, fell into it through trauma and circumstance, finding that they had skills and temperament suited to hunting humans. What made bounty hunters truly feared wasn't just their skills or their willingness to use violence. It was their persistence. A sheriff might give up after a few days of tracking. A marshal might be pulled away by other duties. But a bounty hunter would keep coming month after month if necessary, because their entire income depended on bringing in their target. That relentlessness, that absolute certainty that they would never stop, was psychologically devastating to the people they hunted. Black embodied this quality more than most. His ability to wait, to watch, to methodically eliminate options until his target had nowhere left to run made him particularly effective. But it also made him particularly feared, because criminals facing Black knew that their only options were surrender, escape to somewhere so remote he couldn't follow, or death. There was no negotiating, no bargaining, no appealing to mercy that didn't exist. The methods bounty hunters used varied widely. Some preferred ambushes, overwhelming their targets with sudden violence. Others, like Black, favored patience and planning, studying their targets until they understood their patterns and vulnerabilities. Some worked in teams, using numbers to their advantage. Others worked alone, trusting no one but themselves. The tools of the trade were simple: a good horse, reliable weapons, basic tracking skills, and the ability to survive in harsh conditions with minimal supplies. But the truly successful bounty hunters needed more than that. They needed an understanding of human psychology, the ability to predict where a fugitive might go and what they might do. They needed connections in various towns, people who would pass along information about strangers and suspicious behavior. And they needed a certain coldness, an ability to see their targets as objectives rather than people. This last quality was perhaps the most important and the most damaging. To be effective, bounty hunters had to dehumanize their targets to some degree. You couldn't afford to think too much about their families, their reasons for breaking the law, their humanity. If you did, you'd hesitate at critical moments, and hesitation in this profession often meant death. Black's story illustrates how this dehumanization worked and what it cost. He'd started as a man capable of great empathy, a schoolteacher who cared about children's education and believed in human goodness. The loss of his family had broken something in him, and he'd rebuilt himself as something harder, colder, more functional. But that transformation came at tremendous cost. He'd survived, but he'd lost much of what made life worth living in the process. This pattern repeated across the bounty hunting profession. Men entered it for various reasons, but the work itself changed them, made them harder and more cynical, wore away at their humanity until they became the very thing that made them effective. Some managed to maintain some core of themselves, some connection to who they'd been before. Others lost themselves completely, becoming little more than hunting machines. The physical dangers of bounty hunting were obvious and numerous. Targets fought back, sometimes successfully. The wilderness itself was hostile, full of natural hazards that killed indiscriminately. Other bounty hunters competed for the same rewards, sometimes violently. And there was always the risk of legal complications, of being arrested yourself for the methods you'd used, of being sued by people who claimed you'd violated their rights. But the psychological dangers were perhaps more insidious. The constant violence, the isolation, the need to remain vigilant at all times, the absence of normal human connections and community, all took their toll. Many bounty hunters developed what we now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress: hypervigilance, emotional numbness, difficulty maintaining relationships, substance abuse, depression. Black showed all these symptoms in his later years. His insomnia, his inability to fully relax even in safe environments, his emotional flatness, his drinking, all pointed to someone carrying massive psychological damage. The fact that he could function at all, that he could continue to do his job effectively despite this damage, spoke to a particular kind of strength, but it wasn't a healthy strength. It was the strength of scar tissue, hard and inflexible, covering wounds that never truly healed. The economics of bounty hunting were both its driving force and its limitation. Rewards varied widely, from a few $100s for minor criminals to tens of thousands for the most dangerous outlaws. A successful bounty hunter could make more in a few months than a working man might earn in years. But expenses were high. Horses, weapons, supplies, bribes, informants all cost money. And there were long periods between successful captures, times when hunters earned nothing while still needing to eat and shelter themselves. This economic pressure drove much of the profession's behavior. It explained why hunters preferred to bring targets in dead rather than alive, despite the posters saying either way. Dead men required less food, less watching, less risk of escape. It explained why hunters sometimes bent or broke the law themselves, taking shortcuts that official law enforcement couldn't take. And it explained the fierce competition between hunters, the willingness to sabotage each other or steal each other's bounties. Black's approach was actually unusual in this regard. His preference for bringing targets in alive, while partially motivated by practical considerations, also cost him money. Live captures took longer, required more supplies, carried more risk. That he did it anyway, even as he claimed it was purely business, suggested that some part of his original moral code survived even after everything else had been stripped away. The decline of bounty hunting as a profession paralleled the closing of the frontier itself. As towns grew and organized proper law enforcement, as telegraph and railroad connected formerly isolated areas, as the federal government extended its reach into territories that had been largely autonomous, the need for freelance manhunters diminished. By the 1890s, most of the bounty hunters who'd operated in the wild days of the 1870s and 80s had either died, retired, or transitioned into other forms of work. Some became lawmen themselves, using their tracking and investigation skills in official capacities. Others went into private detective work, essentially continuing the same job but with different employers and different rules. Some, like Gant, found themselves obsolete, unable to adapt to the changing world, ending their lives in poverty and obscurity. The mythology of the bounty hunter, however, outlived the reality. Dime novels and later Hollywood movies created an image of the bounty hunter as a romantic loner, a man of principle standing against chaos, bringing justice to lawless places. This image bore little resemblance to the actual profession, which was brutal, morally ambiguous, and often driven more by economics than idealism. Yet there was something in the mythology that spoke to a deeper truth about American character and American history. The idea of the individual taking on impossible odds, of personal responsibility in the absence of institutions, of justice pursued through determination rather than official authority, all resonated with fundamental American values. The bounty hunter became a symbol, even if the symbol bore little resemblance to the reality. Black's story, particularly as told by Margaret Sullivan, contributed to this mythology while also complicating it. Sullivan's article presented him as neither hero nor villain, but as something more complex, a man trying to maintain humanity in inhuman circumstances, succeeding and failing in equal measure. This nuanced portrayal influenced how later writers and historians thought about bounty hunters and the frontier generally. One aspect of bounty hunting that's often overlooked is its relationship with racial and ethnic minorities. The West, for all its mythological status as a place of freedom and opportunity, was deeply stratified by race. Bounty hunters often targeted Native Americans, Mexicans, African Americans, and Chinese immigrants disproportionately, reflecting and reinforcing the racial hierarchies of the time. Black's record in this regard was mixed. He'd hunted criminals of all races, seemingly without particular bias. His targets had included white outlaws, Hispanic bandits, a few black fugitives, and even one Chinese man wanted for murder in a California mining camp. He treated them all with the same cold professionalism, which was perhaps as close to equality as the system allowed. But he'd also operated within and benefited from a system that was fundamentally unjust, that placed bounties on people's heads, sometimes for crimes that wouldn't have been crimes if committed by someone white. This raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and responsibility. Can you work within an unjust system without becoming unjust yourself? If you apply rules equally but the rules themselves are biased, are you part of the solution or part of the problem? Black never wrestled with these questions explicitly, but they hovered around his story, adding another layer of moral complexity. The role of women in bounty hunting is another overlooked aspect. While the profession was overwhelmingly male, there were a few female bounty hunters who operated in the West. They faced additional challenges beyond those encountered by men: social stigma, legal restrictions, harassment from male hunters and targets alike. Yet some managed to build successful careers, using skills and approaches that sometimes differed from their male counterparts. Black had crossed paths with a few female bounty hunters over the years. One in particular, a woman named Sarah Bridger, had impressed him with her methodical approach and her ability to gain targets' trust before revealing her true purpose. She'd once captured 3 members of a robbery gang by posing as a dance hall girl and gradually working her way into their confidence. When Black heard about it, he'd sought her out to compare notes, one of the few times he'd voluntarily shared information with another hunter. "Men underestimate me," Sarah had told him. "Think I'm just some woman trying to do a man's job. That blindness is my biggest advantage. By the time they realize I'm serious, I already have the drop on them." "Does that bother you?" Black had asked, being underestimated. Sarah had laughed. "Hell no, I use everything I can. This world's hard enough without refusing tools just because they bruise your pride." Black had respected that pragmatism. It was similar to his own approach, using whatever worked without getting hung up on how it looked or what it meant. Sarah Bridger disappeared from the historical record around 1885, and no one knew what became of her. Probably retired under an assumed name, living quietly somewhere, her past erased. As we near the end of Black's story and what it reveals about bounty hunting in the Wild West, I want to take a moment to thank those of you who have stayed with me through this long journey. If this deep dive into forgotten history has helped you find that peaceful place between waking and sleep, please hit that like button and leave a comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. We explore stories like this regularly, always with the goal of combining historical accuracy with the kind of gentle, detailed narration that helps your mind relax. Now, let's talk about what Black's legacy means and how bounty hunting shaped the American legal system we have today. The legal status of bounty hunting was always somewhat uncertain. The practice existed in a gray area between official law enforcement and vigilante justice. Some jurisdictions welcomed bounty hunters as useful auxiliaries to understaffed sheriffs. Others viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as potentially dangerous freelancers who might cause more problems than they solved. This uncertainty led to occasional legal challenges and reforms. Some states and territories tried to regulate bounty hunting, requiring licenses or imposing restrictions on methods. Others tried to ban it outright, though these bans were rarely effective. The criminals didn't stop being criminals, and someone had to track them down. The modern bail bond system emerged partly from the bounty hunting tradition. Today's bail bondsmen and the fugitive recovery agents they employ are direct descendants of Wild West bounty hunters, though they operate under much stricter legal frameworks. They still track down people who have skipped bail, still earn money for bringing fugitives back to face justice, but they work within a more developed legal system, with more oversight and accountability. Some of the techniques pioneered by bounty hunters like Black also influenced the development of professional law enforcement. His methodical approach to tracking, his emphasis on intelligence gathering and pattern analysis, his preference for careful planning over impulsive action, all presaged modern investigative methods. Police detectives today use many of the same principles Black employed, though with better tools and resources. The psychological profile of an effective bounty hunter also influenced how law enforcement agencies thought about recruitment and training. They realized that certain personality traits, the ability to work independently, tolerance for extended solitude, patience, analytical thinking, and emotional control, made for more effective investigators. These insights shaped how police forces were organized and how officers were trained. But perhaps Black's most important legacy, though he never knew it, was his contribution to the ongoing American conversation about justice, violence, and redemption. His story, as told by Margaret Sullivan and later by historians who built on her work, became a touchstone for discussing the moral complexities of frontier life. Was Black a hero? He'd saved lives by capturing dangerous criminals. He'd shown restraint when killing would have been easier. He'd maintained standards in a profession known for its lack of them. But he'd also participated in a system that was often unjust, had delivered men to death knowing their guilt was questionable, had prioritized efficiency over deeper moral considerations. Was he a villain? He'd chosen a profession built on hunting humans for profit. He'd caused suffering, even when he tried to minimize it. He'd become emotionally dead, incapable of normal human connection. He'd let revenge transform him into something cold and mechanical. But he'd also been shaped by unbearable loss, had found purpose in chaos, had tried in his limited way to do things right. The answer, of course, is that he was neither hero nor villain, but simply human. Complex, contradictory, doing the best he could with the tools and understanding he had. His story is compelling not because he was exceptional, but because he was representative. He showed what the frontier did to people, how it tested them, how it forced them to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. The fear that bounty hunters inspired in criminals and law-abiding citizens alike came from this complexity. You couldn't predict what a bounty hunter would do because they operated outside normal social rules. They might be merciful or merciless. They might care about justice or only about money. They might have principles or be completely amoral. This unpredictability, combined with their legal authority and practical power, made them genuinely frightening. Black embodied this unpredictability. Criminals who heard he was tracking them knew he'd bring them in eventually, but they didn't know how he'd treat them in the process. Would he be the man who gave Rosa Velasquez water and brought her in alive? Or would he be the man who shot Jacob Thorne without hesitation? The not knowing was almost worse than the knowing. Regular citizens felt this fear too, though from a different angle. They worried that bounty hunters might mistake their sons or brothers for wanted criminals. They worried about violence spilling into their communities when hunters tracked fugitives to their towns. They worried about a system that granted so much power to unaccountable individuals. These weren't irrational fears. All of these things happened regularly throughout the frontier period. The relationship between bounty hunters and official law enforcement was similarly complex. Sheriffs and marshals often resented bounty hunters for muscling into their territory, for taking credit and rewards for work the lawmen had started. But they also depended on bounty hunters to do jobs they couldn't or wouldn't do themselves. This created a dynamic of mutual resentment and grudging cooperation that characterized frontier justice. Black's interactions with lawmen varied. Some respected him for his professionalism and effectiveness. Others saw him as a necessary evil at best. A few openly despised him, viewing him as a mercenary who debased the concept of justice by reducing it to financial transaction. Black generally didn't care one way or the other. He did his job, collected his money, and moved on. Their opinions weren't his concern. This indifference was itself a kind of statement about the nature of frontier justice. In a world where law was scarce and violence was common, personal relationships and social opinion mattered less than results. You were judged not by your character or your intentions, but by your effectiveness. Did you catch criminals or didn't you? Everything else was commentary. The physical environment of the West shaped bounty hunting in profound ways. The vast distances, the harsh terrain, the extremes of heat and cold, all created challenges that required specific skills and temperament. You had to be able to read landscape, to find water and shelter, to navigate without maps or landmarks. You had to be comfortable with weeks of solitude, with sleeping on hard ground, with eating whatever you could catch or carry. Black had adapted to these demands through years of experience. He knew which plants you could eat and which would kill you. He knew how to find water in the desert by watching where birds flew. He knew how to build a shelter that would keep you alive through a mountain snowstorm. These skills, learned through necessity and practice, were what separated successful bounty hunters from dead ones. The weaponry of bounty hunters evolved during the period, reflecting broader technological changes. In the early 1870s, most hunters carried cap-and-ball revolvers and single-shot rifles, weapons that were reliable but slow to reload. By the 80s, cartridge ammunition and repeating rifles had become common, giving hunters more firepower and faster follow-up shots. Black had started with a pair of Colt Navy revolvers, but he'd switched to Colt Peacemakers in 1874, appreciating their reliability and the availability of ammunition. He carried a Winchester rifle, usually the model 1873, which used the same .44-40 ammunition as his pistols. This commonality meant he only had to carry one type of cartridge, simplifying his supply situation. But weaponry was only part of the equation. Black's real advantage was never his guns, it was his mind. He could outthink most of the people he hunted, could anticipate their moves and position himself accordingly. The physical confrontation, when it came, was usually anticlimactic because he'd already won the psychological battle. This mental aspect of bounty hunting is often overlooked in popular depictions, which focus on gunfights and chases. The reality was that most successful captures happened because the hunter had simply been more patient and thoughtful than the fugitive. Violence was sometimes necessary, but it was rarely the primary tool. Black had studied the criminals he hunted, learning their backgrounds and patterns. He understood that most people, even desperate criminals, followed predictable routines. They'd return to familiar places, seek out people they trusted, make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. By understanding these patterns, Black could position himself where his targets would eventually show up, saving time and effort. This approach required a particular kind of empathy, the ability to imagine yourself into another person's mind, to see the world from their perspective. Ironically, the very quality that had made Black an effective teacher, his ability to understand how other people thought, became his greatest asset as a hunter. He'd lost the emotional warmth that went with that understanding, but the analytical component remained. The isolation of bounty hunting was perhaps its most psychologically damaging aspect. Most hunters worked alone, either by necessity or preference. This meant spending weeks or months with no human contact beyond brief interactions in towns. For someone like Black, who'd already closed himself off emotionally, this isolation reinforced his disconnection from normal human society. There were nights camped in some canyon or hidden in some stand of trees, when Black would look up at the stars and feel the weight of his solitude pressing down like a physical force. He'd think about Mary and the girls, about the life he'd lost, about the person he'd been. Those thoughts were dangerous, threatened the emotional numbness that let him function, so he'd learned to push them away, to focus on practical matters on the hunt. But the thoughts always came back eventually. You can't run from yourself forever, even in the vastness of the West. Sooner or later, in the quiet moments, you have to face what you've become. For Black, those moments of self-awareness were brief and painful, quickly buried under the demands of the next hunt, the next target, the next town. The towns themselves were another interesting aspect of bounty hunting. Each town had its own character, its own power structures and social dynamics. A bounty hunter had to quickly assess these dynamics when entering a new place, figuring out who held real power, who could be trusted, who might cause problems. Making the wrong assessment could be fatal. Black had developed a routine for entering new towns. He'd find the saloon first, have a drink, listen to conversations without participating much. Saloons were information hubs, places where gossip and news flowed freely. In an hour of careful listening, you could learn who was new in town, who was causing trouble, who was connected to whom. Then he'd visit the general store, make a small purchase, chat with the proprietor. Store owners saw everyone and noticed everything. They knew which strangers had money and which were desperate, who was buying supplies for travel and who was settling in. A friendly conversation could yield valuable intelligence. Only then would Black approach the law if the town had any. He'd introduce himself, explain his business, establish that he wasn't a threat to local authority. Most sheriffs appreciated this courtesy, even if they didn't particularly like bounty hunters. It helped avoid misunderstandings that could turn violent. These social skills, the ability to read people and situations, to navigate complex social dynamics quickly and effectively, were as important as tracking ability or skill with weapons. A bounty hunter who couldn't manage these interactions would find himself constantly in conflict, wasting time and energy on problems that could have been avoided. The legal paperwork involved in bounty hunting was another often overlooked aspect. You couldn't just show up with a body or a prisoner and demand payment. There were forms to file, identifications to confirm, officials to satisfy. Some bounty hunters neglected this side of the business and found themselves in legal tangles that cost them time and money. Black had learned early to keep meticulous records. He documented his hunts, saved copies of wanted posters, collected statements from witnesses. When he delivered a prisoner or a body, he had everything necessary to prove identity and claim the reward. This attention to bureaucratic detail made him unpopular with some clerks and officials who resented the extra work, but it protected him from legal challenges. The ethics of bringing in dead bodies versus live prisoners remained a constant source of debate among bounty hunters and society generally. The poster said dead or alive, but there was a world of difference between the two. A live prisoner could testify, could provide information about other criminals, could potentially be reformed. A dead body was just a corpse, proof that someone had been killed but nothing more. Black's preference for live captures, despite his claims that it was purely practical, suggested that some ethical considerations survived in him. Perhaps it was the last connection to his former self, the teacher who'd believed in redemption and second chances. Or perhaps it was just his way of maintaining some distinction between himself and the worst of the bounty hunters, men who killed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The bounty system itself had inherent problems that everyone recognized, but no one knew how to fix. It created a financial incentive to capture or kill people, which could lead to abuses. It put a price on human heads, reducing justice to economic transaction. It encouraged competition and conflict among hunters. It sometimes resulted in innocent people being targeted due to mistaken identity or false accusations. Yet for all its flaws, the system worked better than the alternatives in the context of the frontier. Official law enforcement alone couldn't cover the territory or pursue criminals with sufficient dedication. Vigilante justice was too prone to mob violence and innocent victims. The bounty system, for all its moral ambiguity, at least channeled the violence towards specific targets and provided some accountability through the legal process. Black's story illustrates both the necessity and the cost of the system. He was a product of circumstances, a man shaped by tragedy into a tool for a rough kind of justice. He did work that needed doing, brought criminals to account who might otherwise have escaped consequences. But he paid a terrible price for this role, losing his humanity piece by piece, ending his life isolated and broken. The question that haunted Black in his final weeks, lying in that charity hospital bed, was whether the trade had been worth it. Had he achieved anything meaningful with his years of hunting? Had he made the world better or just added to its violence? Had he honored Mary and the girl's memory or betrayed it by becoming something they wouldn't have recognized? He never found satisfying answers to these questions. Some questions don't have answers, just different ways of looking at them. Margaret Sullivan, in her article, suggested that Black's real achievement wasn't the criminals he caught, but the standards he maintained, the thin line of principle he held to even when it would have been easier not to. Maybe she was right. Maybe the small victories, the moments of restraint and mercy, mattered more than the big picture. Or maybe it was all meaningless, just one man's attempt to impose order on chaos, to find purpose in purposelessness. Maybe Black was just another casualty of the West. Another life ground down by violence and loss, until nothing remained but the shell going through motions. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Black's life mattered to the people he intersected with, the criminals he captured, the citizens who felt safer because dangerous men were removed from circulation, the law enforcement officers whose jobs he made easier. It mattered to Margaret Sullivan, whose article helped people understand the human reality behind frontier myths. It mattered to the historians who would later study this period and use his story to illustrate larger truths. And it matters to us now, listening to his story more than a century after his death. We can learn from his choices, from his successes and failures, from the way he navigated impossible situations. We can reflect on the nature of justice, on what we're willing to sacrifice for it, on where we draw lines and what those lines mean. The fear that bounty hunters inspired in the Wild West came from multiple sources. The practical fear of being hunted by skilled, relentless professionals. The legal fear of a system that granted enormous power to unaccountable individuals. The existential fear of what humans become when stripped of social constraints and driven by primal motivations like revenge and greed. And perhaps most fundamentally, the fear of our own capacity for violence and coldness, reflected back at us in exaggerated form. Black represented all of these fears. He was the hunter who never stopped, the cold mechanism of justice without compassion, the reminder that civilization was a thin veneer over something darker. When people looked at him, they saw what they might become if circumstances pushed them far enough, if they lost enough, if they hardened themselves sufficiently against feeling. That's why his story resonated then and continues to resonate now. It's not really about bounty hunting, though that's the framework. It's about human transformation, about loss and adaptation, about the costs of survival in harsh environments. It's about what we give up to keep going and whether what we keep is worth what we've lost. The profession of bounty hunting attracted men and women from all walks of life, each with their own reasons for choosing this particular path. Some were former soldiers who'd learned to fight in the Civil War and couldn't adjust to peacetime. Others were lawmen who'd grown frustrated with jurisdictional limits and bureaucratic constraints. Still others were simply opportunists who saw a way to make money using skills they already possessed. There was a bounty hunter named Thomas Garrett who'd been a doctor before turning to hunting men. He'd lost his medical license after a patient died during surgery, a death that might not have been his fault but ruined his reputation nonetheless. Unable to practice medicine, he'd taken his knowledge of anatomy and applied it to tracking and capturing fugitives. He could read injuries, understand how damaged men would move and what they'd need, predict where wounded criminals would seek help. Garrett had crossed paths with Black twice, and both times they'd ended up working together briefly, their complementary skills making them effective as a temporary team. Garrett would track through medical knowledge, Black through psychology and pattern recognition. Together they'd brought in several difficult targets that neither could have caught alone. "You ever think about what we've become?" Garrett asked Black once as they camped between towns. "I was supposed to save lives. Now I hunt people for money. How does that happen?" "It happens slowly," Black had replied. "One choice at a time, each one seeming necessary, until you look back and don't recognize the road you've traveled." Garrett had nodded, understanding in his eyes. Can we go back? Can we become who we were? Black had taken a long time to answer. "I don't know," he'd finally said. "I think about that sometimes, but I don't know." They'd parted ways after that hunt, and Black never saw Thomas Garrett again. He heard years later that Garrett had been killed in a shootout in Arizona, dying in the dust outside a mining camp, far from the operating rooms where he'd once tried to heal people. The stories of bounty hunters were often like that, tragedies of wasted potential and corrupted purpose. Men and women who might have been doctors, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, reduced to hunting other humans for money, dying violent deaths far from home. The West consumed people, used them up and discarded them, indifferent to their hopes or potential. Yet there were exceptions, people who managed to leave the profession intact or even improved. A woman named Elizabeth Cole hunted bounties for 7 years before retiring with enough money to buy a boarding house in Sacramento. She married, raised 3 children, lived to be 82. She never talked about her bounty hunting years, kept that part of her life separate and hidden, but she'd survived it without losing herself entirely. A man named Marcus Webb, a former slave who'd taken up bounty hunting after the war, captured enough criminals to establish himself as a skilled professional. He eventually became a marshal in Kansas, using his hunting skills in an official capacity. He was killed in the line of duty in 1891, but he died defending a town, wearing a badge, recognized and respected. His funeral was attended by hundreds. These stories of survival and transition were rarer than the tragedies, but they existed. They proved that it was possible, at least sometimes, to pass through the fire of frontier violence and come out the other side still human, still capable of building a life. Black had not been one of these success stories. He'd survived the physical dangers, but not the psychological ones. The violence and isolation had hollowed him out, left him functioning but not truly alive. His death in that Kansas City hospital was almost a relief, an ending to a story that had really finished years earlier, when he'd stopped being Elijah the schoolteacher and become Black the bounty hunter. The mythology that grew up around bounty hunters after the frontier closed served multiple purposes. It romanticized a brutal profession, making it seem more noble than it was. But it also preserved something important, the memory of a time when individuals could make significant differences, when personal courage and determination could change outcomes. Even if the reality was messier and darker than the myths, the core truth remained. There had been people who'd done dangerous work in impossible circumstances, who'd imposed order on chaos through sheer willpower. The dime novels of the late 1800s and early 1900s portrayed bounty hunters as heroes, noble gunslingers bringing justice to lawless territories. These novels were wildly popular, selling millions of copies, shaping how Americans thought about their frontier past. The heroes of these stories were always good shots, brave to the point of recklessness, and motivated by pure justice rather than money. The real bounty hunters, men like Black, bore little resemblance to these fictional heroes. They were complicated, morally ambiguous, often damaged people doing a dirty job for practical reasons. But the myth served a purpose, giving Americans a way to think about their violent past without confronting its full ugliness. It was easier to celebrate legendary heroes than to wrestle with the messy reality of men hunting men for profit. Hollywood would later take these dime novel tropes and amplify them, creating an entire genre around the figure of the bounty hunter. Movies portrayed them as cool, confident professionals with quirky personalities and hearts of gold. Some of these films, ironically, circled back around to something closer to truth, acknowledging the moral complexity and psychological cost of the profession. But most stayed firmly in the realm of myth, entertaining audiences while obscuring history. The real historical record of bounty hunting is preserved in scattered documents. Wanted posters, reward claims, court records, newspaper accounts, personal letters, and occasional interviews like the one Black gave Margaret Sullivan. Historians piecing together this record have to work with fragments, filling in gaps with informed speculation, trying to separate fact from legend. What emerges from this historical work is a picture of a profession that was more complicated than either its mythologizers or its critics wanted to admit. Bounty hunters weren't universally heroes or villains. They were individuals making choices within a particular system, some better and more principled than others, all shaped by circumstances and limitations we can only partially understand from our modern vantage point. The question of whether bounty hunting was justice or just legalized violence remains contested. Law professors and ethicists still debate the frontier justice system, using bounty hunting as a case study in how societies handle crime when formal institutions are weak or absent. Some argue that the system, for all its flaws, was better than alternatives. Others insist it was fundamentally corrupt, that putting bounties on humans was inherently dehumanizing and led inevitably to abuse. Black's story doesn't resolve this debate, but it illuminates it. His career showed both the necessity of bounty hunting in that time and place, and the terrible costs it extracted from those who practiced it. He was simultaneously a force for order and a product of chaos, a man trying to impose rules on a ruleless world while being twisted by that world into something he'd never intended to become. The physical artifacts of bounty hunting are rare and scattered. A few wanted posters survive in museums and private collections, their faces staring out from yellowed paper, offering rewards for men and women long dead. Some bounty hunters' weapons have been preserved, Colts and Winchesters now displayed behind glass, cleaned and oiled, silent about the violence they facilitated. Black's possessions were mostly lost or destroyed. The carpet bag he'd been carrying when he died was eventually thrown away by the hospital, its contents deemed worthless. His horse and saddle had been sold before he left for Kansas City. The money he'd hidden in various places across the frontier was never recovered, probably found by random prospectors or homesteaders who had no idea whose fortune they'd stumbled upon. The only physical remnant of his existence was the article Margaret Sullivan wrote, which was reprinted several times and eventually made its way into academic collections. Researchers studying frontier history would occasionally encounter it, learn about Elijah Blackwood, and wonder about the man behind the spare, factual narrative. A few tried to dig deeper to find more information about him, but there wasn't much to find. He'd lived quietly between hunts, kept to himself, left few traces. This absence of physical evidence is typical of most bounty hunters. They were transient by profession, moving constantly, accumulating few possessions, dying far from home. The frontier swallowed them up, leaving behind little more than names in old newspapers and faces on wanted posters. Their stories survived primarily in oral tradition, passed down and embellished, gradually transforming into legend. The transition from frontier to settled civilization happened unevenly across the West. Some areas were tamed and organized quickly, while others remained wild into the 20th century. Bounty hunting persisted in these remaining wild areas, but it was increasingly regulated and professionalized. The freelance hunters of Black's era gave way to professionals working for bail bondsmen or private detective agencies, operating under stricter legal frameworks. By the early 1900s, the classical frontier bounty hunter was essentially extinct. The men who'd hunted criminals across open territories, living by their wits and their guns, had either died, retired, or adapted to new circumstances. The world had changed around them, and most couldn't or wouldn't change with it. This disappearance wasn't mourned by many. Bounty hunters had never been popular, even when they were necessary. They represented a kind of justice that civilized society wanted to leave behind, rough and ready and personally motivated. As America became more urbanized and organized, there was less and less place for men like Black, skilled in violence and tracking but little else. Yet the skills and mindset of bounty hunters found new applications in the modern world. Private investigators, skip tracers, fugitive recovery agents, FBI profilers, all drew on techniques and approaches pioneered by frontier bounty hunters. The profession evolved rather than disappearing completely, adapting to new legal and social contexts while maintaining its core function of finding people who didn't want to be found. The psychological profile that made someone an effective bounty hunter also translated to these modern professions. The patience, the analytical mind, the comfort with solitude and danger, the ability to read human behavior and predict actions, all remained valuable. Men and women with Black's temperament found new outlets for their particular skills, working within more structured systems but still doing fundamentally similar work. The fear that bounty hunters inspired also persisted in modified form. People today still find the idea of being hunted unsettling, still worry about skip tracers and repo men showing up at their doors, still have complicated feelings about professionals who make their living by pursuing other people. The context has changed, but the underlying dynamic remains recognizable. Before we move toward the conclusion of this long journey through frontier justice and one man's embodiment of its contradictions, I want to remind you to engage with this content. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Black's story, about bounty hunting, about the Wild West generally. Hit that like button if this is helping you relax and find sleep. And subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more stories like this, deep dives into forgotten history, told in a way designed to calm your mind and ease you into rest. Now, let's bring Black's story to its final resting place and explore what it all means. The summer of 1882, when Black lay dying in Kansas City, was particularly hot. The hospital had large windows to let in air, but the air itself was thick and humid, offering little relief. Black spent his days drifting in and out of consciousness, his ravaged lungs struggling to draw breath, his mind wandering between present and past. In his lucid moments, he thought about the life he'd lived, trying to find meaning or pattern in it. He'd been a husband, a father, a teacher, then a hunter of men. He'd killed more people than he'd been able to count, though most of those had been in self-defense or necessary to complete captures. He'd brought dozens to justice, preventing them from harming others. He'd earned and lost a fortune. He'd been feared across 3 territories. And for what? He was dying alone in a charity ward, with nothing to show for his years of work except scars and broken lungs, and a hollow place where his emotions used to be. No one would remember him except as a figure in Margaret Sullivan's article, an example of something, though he wasn't entirely sure what. In his fever dreams, Mary came to him sometimes. She looked the way she had on their wedding day, young and hopeful, her eyes bright with plans for their future. She never spoke in these dreams, just looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Disappointment, pity, forgiveness. He'd wake from these dreams disoriented and sad, not sure which world was real. The girls appeared too, always playing, always laughing, always just out of reach. He'd try to call to them, but his voice wouldn't work in the dreams. They'd look over their shoulders at him, still playing, and he'd know with dream logic that they were already gone, that he was seeing something that had ended years ago. Sometimes he dreamed about the men he'd hunted. Coleman Reeves sitting in that mission ruin, Catherine Drake walking down a street in Silver Creek, Jacob Thorne smiling as he raised his rifle. They didn't accuse him or threaten him. They just existed in his dreams the way they'd existed in life, doing what they'd done, being who they'd been. He was just an observer in these dreams, watching events unfold without being able to change them. The hospital staff were kind to him in their busy, distracted way. A nun named Sister Teresa checked on him regularly, brought him water, adjusted his pillows, said prayers that he didn't really listen to but found comforting anyway in their rhythm and repetition. She asked him once if he had family she should contact, and he'd said no, there was no one. She'd looked sad at that, had squeezed his hand, had said something about God's love being sufficient. He'd nodded, not wanting to explain that he'd stopped thinking about God around the same time he'd stopped thinking about much of anything else. Margaret Sullivan's visits were the bright points in those final weeks. She'd bring him newspapers, read to him when his eyes were too weak to focus, talk about her article and her other projects. She told him about the West she was documenting, the people she was interviewing, the stories she was collecting. "You're part of something larger," she told him one afternoon. "Your story helps people understand what this time was really like. Not the dime novel version, but the truth. That matters." Black wasn't sure he believed her, but he appreciated the sentiment. It was nice to think that his life might mean something beyond the immediate facts of captures and kills, that there might be some larger purpose to the years of hunting and violence. "Tell me about teaching," Margaret said during one visit. "What was it like before everything changed?" Black closed his eyes, reaching back through the years to memories he usually kept locked away. "It was simple," he said quietly. "I'd wake up knowing what the day would bring. Lessons to teach, papers to grade, children to help understand the world. Mary would pack my lunch, kiss me goodbye. The girls would want me to play with them when I got home. It was ordinary. I didn't know how precious ordinary was." "You were good at it?" Margaret asked. "I think so. I liked helping children learn, watching them figure things out. There's something miraculous about a child's mind, the way they can grasp new concepts, make connections. I'd wanted to spend my life doing that, helping shape young minds." He paused, his breathing labored. "Instead, I spent it tracking killers through the desert. Life takes strange turns." Margaret wrote in her notebook, capturing his words. "Do you regret it, the choice to become a bounty hunter?" Black thought about this for a long time. "I don't know if I chose it," he finally said. "Feels more like it chose me. After Mary and the girls died, I couldn't be that person anymore. The teacher died with them. What was left just tried to survive, to find some purpose. Bounty hunting gave me that. It wasn't a good purpose, but it was something." "You saved lives," Margaret reminded him. "The criminals you caught, they would have hurt more people if you hadn't stopped them." "Maybe," Black allowed, "or maybe someone else would have caught them. Or maybe they'd have been killed by other outlaws, or died of disease, or just given up and settled down. You can't know what would have happened. I just know what did happen and what it cost me." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the hospital around them. Other patients coughing and moaning, nurses moving between beds, the distant sounds of the city outside. "I'm afraid," Black said suddenly. It was the first time he'd admitted this to anyone, maybe the first time he'd admitted it to himself. "I'm afraid there's nothing after this, that I'll just stop like a clock running down. No heaven, no hell, no reunion with Mary and the girls, just nothing." Margaret took his hand. "I don't know what's next," she said honestly. "Nobody does really, no matter what they claim. But I think the love you had for your family, that doesn't just disappear. Love changes things, leaves marks on the world. Maybe that's what survives." Black wanted to believe her. He tried to hold on to that thought as he drifted back into fevered sleep. Love leaving marks on the world. It was a better thought than the alternative, that everything just ended in darkness and silence. The night he died was quiet, no dramatic final words or revelations. Sister Teresa had checked on him around 2 a.m, found him sleeping peacefully for once, his breathing slightly easier than usual. When she checked again at 5, he was gone, his eyes closed, his expression calm. She said a prayer over his body, then went to inform the hospital administrator that another patient had passed. They buried him 2 days later in the city cemetery, in the section reserved for indigents and unknown persons. No marker, no ceremony beyond the brief prayer Sister Teresa offered. Just another body going into the ground, returning to the earth that had sustained and eventually claimed him. News of Black's death spread slowly through the bounty hunting community. Some hunters shrugged, unsurprised that he died alone and broke despite his successes. Others felt a strange sense of loss, recognizing that something had ended with him, some remnant of an older way of doing things. The profession was changing, becoming more corporate and less personal, and Black had been one of the last representatives of the old school. Lucius Gant heard about Black's death while drinking in a saloon in Oklahoma Territory. His first reaction was satisfaction, pleasure that his old rival was gone. But this satisfaction curdled quickly into something else, a hollow feeling he couldn't quite name. He'd spent years hatting Black, blaming him for his failures, imagining their final confrontation. Now that confrontation would never happen, and the hatred suddenly seemed pointless, wasted energy directed at a ghost. Gant got very drunk that night, the kind of drunk where you start talking to yourself and picking fights with strangers. He told anyone who would listen about Elijah Blackwood, about how they'd been enemies, about how Black had ruined him. But as he talked, the story kept shifting, becoming less about rivalry and more about respect, about how Black had been a true professional, how he'd had standards in a profession without standards. By the end of the night, Gant was crying into his whiskey, mourning not just Black but the West itself, the life they'd both lived that was slipping away into memory and myth. The bartender eventually cut him off and helped him to a room upstairs, where he passed out still muttering about bounty hunters and justice and the good old days that had never actually been good. Other people whose lives Black had touched reacted in various ways to news of his death. Coleman Reeves, the outlaw he'd captured in that Spanish mission, had already been hanged by the time Black died, so he never knew. Catherine Drake, the counterfeiter, wrote a brief note in her journal. Read today that Blackwood died in Kansas City. Feel nothing about this, which is strange. He captured me but treated me fairly. I suppose I should be grateful he chose to bring me in alive. May he find peace. Jimmy Dalton, the horse thief, was working his small ranch in California when he heard. He stopped what he was doing, stood still for a long moment, then went inside and poured himself a drink. To Blackwood, he said to the empty room, "You were hard but you were fair." Then he went back to work. The moment passed, life continuing as it always did. Margaret Sullivan wrote an obituary for Harper's Magazine, a brief piece that summarized Black's career and character. Elijah Blackwood died as he lived, she wrote, alone, unrecognized, with little to show for years of dangerous work. Yet his story illuminates a crucial period in American history, showing us both the necessity and the cost of frontier justice. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more complicated and more human. May he rest easier in death than he did in life. The obituary was read by thousands across the country, and for a brief moment, Elijah Blackwood's name was known. People discussed him over dinner, argued about whether he represented the best or worst of frontier values, used him as an example in broader debates about law and order and American character. Then, as happens with all news, attention moved on to other stories, other names, other controversies. Black faded back into obscurity, remembered only by specialists and history enthusiasts. But the impact of his story persisted in subtle ways. Law enforcement agencies studying frontier justice used his methods as case studies. Writers crafting Western novels drew on characters like him for inspiration. Historians trying to understand the period referenced his career as an example of typical bounty hunter experiences. His life became data points and footnotes, pieces of a larger mosaic depicting the American West. The fear that bounty hunters inspired in the Wild West era gradually transformed as the frontier closed and civilization advanced. Physical fear, the terror of being hunted across open territory by skilled professionals, diminished as law enforcement became more organized and effective. But a different kind of fear persisted, a cultural anxiety about the thin line between law and lawlessness, about what happens when individuals take justice into their own hands. This anxiety manifests in modern American culture in various ways. Our ambivalence about vigilante justice, our fascination with loners who operate outside the system, our debates about where to draw lines between individual rights and social order, all echo the dilemmas that bounty hunters embodied. We're still wrestling with questions that Black's story raises. When is violence justified? Who gets to enforce rules? What do we sacrifice for safety? How do we balance personal freedom with communal security? The West that Black inhabited no longer exists except in memory and imagination. The open ranges have been fenced. The wild towns have become cities with police departments and municipal courts. The outlaws are mostly gone, replaced by different kinds of criminals operating in different contexts. The bounty hunters have evolved into bail bondsmen and skip tracers and private investigators, working within much more structured legal frameworks. Yet something of that era's spirit remains in American consciousness. The idea of the frontier as a place where individuals could reinvent themselves, where determination and skill mattered more than background or credentials, where justice was personal and immediate rather than bureaucratic and distant. These ideas shape how Americans think about themselves and their country, for better and worse. Black's story complicates this frontier mythology. He shows us that reinvention came at tremendous cost, that determination could be directed toward dark purposes, that personal justice was often arbitrary and cruel. His life doesn't fit neatly into triumphalist narratives about American expansion and civilization. It's too messy, too tragic, too morally complex. But that complexity is precisely what makes his story valuable. History isn't neat. People aren't simply good or bad. Systems don't work perfectly or fail completely. Black's career as a bounty hunter illustrates these truths in ways that simpler, more heroic stories cannot. He was doing necessary work in impossible circumstances, maintaining thin threads of order in chaos, paying terrible prices for choices that seemed inevitable at the time. The landscape that Black traveled through still exists, though it's been transformed almost beyond recognition. The deserts and mountains are still there, but they're crossed by highways now, dotted with towns and cities, mapped and measured and thoroughly known. You can drive in a few hours what took Black weeks to traverse on horseback. The wilderness has been tamed, or at least contained. Yet if you go to the right places at the right times, you can still get a sense of what Black experienced. Stand in a canyon at sunset in Utah or New Mexico, watch the light change on rock faces, feel the vastness and emptiness, and you can imagine what it was like to hunt men through this landscape. The physical environment hasn't changed that much. It's just that we've insulated ourselves from it with technology and infrastructure. Some modern bounty hunters, the professionals who work for bail bondsmen tracking down people who have skipped court dates, describe their work in terms that would sound familiar to Black. The patience required, the research and investigation, the need to understand psychology and predict behavior, the long hours of surveillance and waiting. The surface details have changed, but the fundamental nature of hunting humans remains recognizable. These modern practitioners often express mixed feelings about their work, similar to what Black must have felt. They know they're providing a necessary service, making sure people face legal consequences for their actions. But they also recognize the moral ambiguity of making money from other people's problems, of reducing human beings to bounties and transactions. Some quit after a few years, unable to sustain the psychological toll. Others become hardened, developing emotional armor similar to what Black developed. The question of whether bounty hunting is justice or just violence remains unresolved in modern American law. Courts have issued contradictory rulings about the rights and limitations of bail bondsmen and their agents. Some states heavily regulate the industry, while others leave it largely alone. This legal uncertainty reflects deeper cultural uncertainty about the role of private enforcement in a democratic society. Black never had to think about these questions in abstract philosophical terms. For him, it was all practical and immediate. There were wanted criminals, there were rewards for capturing them. He had skills that made him effective at the work. The morality of the system was someone else's concern. He just did what he was good at and tried not to think too deeply about implications and meanings. But the implications and meanings exist whether we think about them or not. The bounty hunting system that Black operated within was built on certain assumptions about crime and punishment, about individual rights and social order, about what justice means and how it should be administered. Those assumptions reflected the values and limitations of frontier society, and examining them helps us understand both that society and our own. One key assumption was that criminals forfeited certain rights by breaking laws. They could be hunted, captured, killed if necessary, with minimal oversight or accountability. This assumption justified extraordinary measures and granted enormous power to bounty hunters. But it also created obvious opportunities for abuse, for innocent people to be targeted, for excessive violence to be employed. Black generally tried to respect the rights of the people he hunted, treating them humanely within the constraints of his profession. But he also operated within a system that didn't require this respect, that gave him nearly unlimited discretion in how he pursued and captured his targets. The fact that he chose restraint doesn't change the systemic reality that such restraint was optional rather than mandatory. Another key assumption was that private citizens could and should participate in law enforcement when official mechanisms were inadequate. This assumption reflected practical necessity in the frontier context, but also ideological commitments to individual responsibility and limited government. It shaped American legal culture in ways that persist today, influencing debates about gun rights, self-defense, and citizen involvement in crime prevention. Black embodied this assumption, stepping into a role that official law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't fill. His effectiveness validated the bounty hunting system, proved that private enforcement could work when properly motivated. But his personal decline also illustrated the costs of this approach, the way it consumed the people who practiced it, leaving them damaged and diminished. A third assumption was that justice could be reduced to transaction, that catching criminals was fundamentally an economic problem that could be solved through financial incentives. This assumption produced the bounty system, which undeniably worked in the limited sense of generating captures and convictions. But it also commodified human beings, made them into prizes to be collected, and created perverse incentives that sometimes led to abuses. Black participated in this commodification every time he collected a reward. He'd reduced complex human beings with their own stories and motivations to dollar amounts, measured their worth by what their capture would earn him. This transactional approach made his work psychologically sustainable, allowing him to hunt without excessive emotional engagement. But it also contributed to his emotional deadening, his inability to connect with people as anything other than targets or obstacles. These assumptions and their consequences shaped not just bounty hunting, but frontier society generally. The West was built on a peculiar mix of idealism and brutality, of high-minded principles and expedient violence. People came west to escape constraints and build new lives, but they brought their old conflicts and prejudices with them, recreating familiar hierarchies and power structures in new settings. Bounty hunters like Black existed at the intersection of these contradictions. They were agents of law operating outside normal legal constraints, individuals serving collective security needs, violent men ostensibly working toward peaceful ends. They embodied the frontier's promise and its problems, its possibility and its darkness. The stories that survive about bounty hunters reflect this complexity. Some tales celebrate them as heroes bringing order to chaos. Others condemn them as mercenaries profiting from violence. Most, if they're honest, acknowledge both elements, recognizing that bounty hunters were neither purely good nor purely evil, but complicated figures navigating impossible situations. Black's story falls into this latter category. He did real good, removing dangerous criminals from circulation, preventing future crimes and victims. He also participated in systemic violence, reduced human beings to economic units, damaged himself psychologically in ways that eventually killed him. Both things are true simultaneously, and understanding his story means holding both truths in mind without trying to resolve them into simpler narratives. The cultural work that bounty hunter stories do in American mythology is complex and often contradictory. They allow us to celebrate individualism while acknowledging its costs, to romanticize violence while recognizing its consequences, to valorize frontier life while understanding its harshness. They give us a way to think about justice that's more nuanced than simple hero narratives, but less bleak than pure cynicism. Black's story does this work particularly effectively because he resists easy categorization. He wasn't heroic in any conventional sense, driven by personal tragedy rather than noble ideals, maintaining standards more from habit than conviction. But he also wasn't villainous, choosing restraint when violence would have been easier, treating his targets with basic dignity despite reducing them to transactions. He was just a man doing difficult work in a difficult time, succeeding and failing in ways that feel recognizably human. This human quality is what makes his story endure beyond its immediate historical context. We can recognize ourselves in Black, see our own struggles with loss and purpose and meaning reflected in his choices. We might never hunt criminals for bounty money, but we understand what it's like to lose something irreplaceable, to have to rebuild ourselves after trauma, to question whether we've become someone we can live with. The fear that bounty hunters inspired wasn't just about physical danger, though that was real enough. It was also about existential dread, about what we're capable of becoming when circumstances push us far enough. Black scared people because he showed them their own potential for transformation, for hardening, for doing whatever it takes to survive even when survival comes at the cost of who we are. This fear remains relevant in contemporary America, even though the specific context of frontier bounty hunting is long gone. We still worry about what we might become under sufficient pressure, about where we draw lines and what we'd be willing to sacrifice. We still struggle with questions about when violence is justified, about who should enforce rules and under what constraints, about how to balance individual freedom with collective security. Black's life doesn't answer these questions, but it illustrates them powerfully. His story becomes a lens through which we can examine these persistent dilemmas, thinking through their implications in a specific historical context that's removed enough to allow perspective but relevant enough to feel meaningful. The daily reality of bounty hunting involved far more tedium than excitement. For every dramatic confrontation or dangerous chase, there were weeks of routine investigation, following cold trails, asking questions in dusty towns, piecing together fragments of information into actionable intelligence. This was the part that dime novels and movies left out, the grinding patience required to do the work successfully. Black would spend hours in saloons, nursing a single drink while listening to conversations around him. He'd talk with stable hands about which strangers had passed through recently, with shopkeepers about unusual purchases, with prostitutes who often knew more about local criminal activity than sheriffs did. He'd cross-reference this information, looking for patterns and connections, building a picture of where his target might have gone. This investigative work required a different skill set than gunfighting or tracking. You had to be able to talk to people without seeming threatening or too curious. You had to remember details and recognize when someone was lying or holding back information. You had to understand social dynamics, know who to trust and who to avoid, navigate complex webs of loyalty and self-interest. Black excelled at this aspect of the work in ways that complemented his tracking abilities. He could read people the way he read landscapes, seeing what was hidden beneath surfaces, understanding motivations and likely behaviors. This psychological insight made him effective, but also contributed to his cynicism. When you spend years studying the worst of human nature, cataloging deceptions and betrayals, you start to believe that's all there is. The economics of frontier life shaped bounty hunting in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Rewards were paid in various forms: cash, bank drafts, sometimes even gold or silver coin. Getting paid often took weeks or months, as authorities verified identities and processed paperwork. Bounty hunters had to manage cash flow carefully, balancing expenses against uncertain future income. Black kept most of his money in the form of gold and silver coin, which he cached in various locations across his territory. He didn't trust banks much, having seen too many fail during economic panics. This meant he traveled light, but had resources hidden where he could access them if needed. The system worked well enough during his active years, but it meant his accumulated wealth was lost when he died, scattered across the West in hiding places no one else knew about. Other bounty hunters managed their finances differently. Some did trust banks, keeping accounts in major cities where they could draw funds as needed. Others spent money as fast as they earned it, living high when rewards came in and scraping by between captures. A few invested in property or businesses, trying to build something more permanent than a career hunting men. The social position of bounty hunters was ambiguous and uncomfortable. They weren't quite lawmen, not quite civilians, not quite criminals. They existed in a liminal space, accepted out of necessity but never fully trusted or respected. This social isolation reinforced the professional isolation, making it difficult for bounty hunters to maintain normal relationships or integrate into communities. Black felt this isolation keenly, though he'd chosen it to some degree. He could have tried harder to make connections, to build friendships and relationships, but doing so would have required emotional availability he no longer possessed. It was easier to remain alone, to accept that isolation was the price of his profession, than to risk opening himself up to more loss. The few friendships he did maintain were with other bounty hunters, people who understood the work and its demands. But even these relationships were limited and transactional. Hunters might cooperate on specific cases when it served their interests, might share information about targets or territories, but they also competed for the same rewards, sometimes sabotaged each other's hunts, generally kept their distance. Thomas Garrett, the former doctor who'd hunted with Black briefly, was probably the closest thing to a friend Black had during his bounty hunting years. They'd corresponded occasionally, meeting up when their paths crossed, sharing meals and conversation. But even this relationship had limits. They never talked about personal matters, never got too deep into feelings or vulnerabilities. They were colleagues who respected each other, nothing more. When Black heard about Garrett's death in that Arizona mining camp, he'd felt something that might have been grief if he'd still been capable of feeling deeply. Instead, it was just a hollow recognition of loss, one more person gone from an already diminished world. He'd gotten drunk that night, something he rarely did, and toasted Garrett's memory alone in his camp. Then he'd packed up and moved on because that's what you did. You kept moving. The violence of bounty hunting affected different hunters in different ways. Some became inured to it, seeing shootings and killings as just part of the job, no more significant than shoeing a horse or fixing a saddle. Others developed elaborate justifications, convincing themselves that every act of violence was necessary and righteous. Still others were haunted by what they'd done, carrying guilt and trauma that eventually broke them. Black fell somewhere in the middle. He didn't enjoy violence or seek it out, but he didn't agonize over it either when it seemed necessary. Each shooting, each beating, each act of force was evaluated pragmatically. Did it serve the goal of capturing the target? Was there a less violent alternative? If violence was the most efficient option, he employed it without hesitation or regret. This pragmatic approach served him professionally, but damaged him personally. By treating violence as just another tool, he'd divorced it from its moral and emotional significance. He'd made it routine, ordinary, something you did when circumstances required. This allowed him to function without being paralyzed by conscience, but it also meant losing part of what made him human. The dreams came sometimes, though. Faces of men he'd killed, appearing in his sleep with expressions he couldn't read. They didn't accuse him or plead with him. They just looked at him, present and undeniable. He'd wake from these dreams feeling unsettled, questioning choices he'd made years before. But daylight always brought back the pragmatic perspective, the understanding that he'd done what he had to do, that dwelling on it served no purpose. The physical toll of bounty hunting was considerable and cumulative. Years of sleeping on hard ground, eating irregular meals, riding for days through harsh weather, all wore down the body. Most bounty hunters showed the effects by their 40s, looking a decade older than they were, moving stiffly, dealing with chronic pains and injuries that never fully healed. Black's tuberculosis was partly a product of this lifestyle. his lungs damaged by countless nights in cold mountain camps, by dust storms and bad air and persistent coughing that he'd ignored. The frostbite he'd gotten tracking Jacob Thorne had cost him parts of 2 fingers, leaving his hands permanently weakened. His back hurt constantly from old injuries and hard riding. His hearing was diminished from too many gunshots without protection. These physical problems were universal among long-term bounty hunters. The work simply destroyed bodies over time. Smart hunters retired before the damage became permanent, taking their earnings and building quieter lives. But many, like Black, couldn't or wouldn't stop. The work had become their identity, and retiring would mean confronting questions about who they were without it. The relationship between bounty hunters and Native Americans was complex and varied. Some tribes and bands cooperated with bounty hunters, seeing them as less threatening than army units or large posses. Others treated all white men with suspicion and hostility, making no distinctions between law enforcement types. Still others had their own complicated relationships with the criminal underworld, sometimes sheltering fugitives for their own reasons. Black had learned early to approach Native communities carefully and respectfully. He'd spent time learning basic words in several languages, studying customs and protocols. When tracking led him onto reservation or tribal land, he'd announce himself and explain his business, making it clear he was pursuing a specific individual and had no interest in broader conflicts. This approach usually worked. Most tribal leaders understood that bounty hunters weren't their primary problem and didn't want unnecessary confrontations. They might or might not help, depending on various factors, but they generally tolerated hunters who showed proper respect. A few times, Black had received substantial assistance from Native scouts who knew the terrain better than any white tracker could. But there were dangerous exceptions. Black had once tracked a fugitive into Apache territory in Arizona, following a trail that led into mountains the Apache considered sacred. He'd been warned by a scout that continuing would likely get him killed, that the Apache would see his presence as sacrilege regardless of his intentions. He'd stopped, abandoning that particular hunt, recognizing that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed no matter how much money was at stake. That restraint, that recognition of limits, was rare among bounty hunters. Many would have pushed forward convinced of their right to pursue fugitives anywhere. Some of these hunters ended up dead, their bodies found weeks later if they were found at all. Black's willingness to acknowledge he was operating in someone else's territory, that his claims and rights didn't automatically supersede theirs, reflected a kind of wisdom and humility that the profession generally lacked. The technological changes happening during Black's career subtly transformed bounty hunting. Telegraph lines made communication faster, allowing information about fugitives to spread more quickly. Photography meant wanted posters could include actual images rather than just descriptions. Railroads made travel faster and more predictable, changing how both criminals and hunters moved across territory. Black adapted to these changes pragmatically. He learned to use telegraphs effectively, sending and receiving messages that helped him coordinate with law enforcement and track target movements. He carried photographs when they were available, finding them more reliable than verbal descriptions. He used railroads when they served his purposes, though he preferred horseback for actual tracking and pursuit. But these technological advantages came with trade-offs. The same tools that helped hunters also helped fugitives escape faster and communicate warnings to Confederates. The railroad that could carry a hunter to a distant town could also carry his target in the opposite direction. Technology made everything faster, but not necessarily easier or more certain. The closing of the frontier was partly a technological phenomenon. As communication and transportation improved, as empty spaces filled with settlements, as federal authority extended into formally autonomous territories, the conditions that made bounty hunting necessary gradually disappeared. This wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual transformation that accelerated through the 1880s and 90s. Black witnessed the early stages of this transformation and recognized what it meant for his profession. The towns that had welcomed or tolerated bounty hunters were establishing proper police forces. Territorial governments were expanding and professionalizing law enforcement. The Federal Marshal Service was becoming more effective and comprehensive. Space for freelance manhunters was shrinking. Some hunters saw this coming and prepared accordingly. They transitioned into private detective work or sought official law enforcement positions. Others denied what was happening, insisting that there would always be criminals to hunt and rewards to collect. Black fell somewhere in between, acknowledging the changes but not knowing how to adapt, watching his world disappear without having a clear vision of what would replace it. His attempted escape to Kansas City represented a kind of surrender to these changes, an admission that the frontier he'd known was ending and he needed to find something else. But he'd left it too late, waited until his body was already broken and his spirit exhausted. He was trying to start over when he had nothing left to start with. This pattern repeated across the bounty hunting community. Men who'd built their lives around hunting outlaws found themselves obsolete, their skills no longer needed or wanted. Some adjusted, but many didn't. The suicide rate among former bounty hunters was notably high, though no one kept official statistics. They just disappeared from records, presumably dead, but who knew where or how. The psychological impact of obsolescence shouldn't be underestimated. When your entire identity is built around a particular role, losing that role feels like losing yourself. Black had been Elijah the schoolteacher, then Elijah the grieving husband and father, then Black the bounty hunter. Each identity had replaced the previous one completely. When bounty hunting started to end, he had nothing to replace it with, no sense of who he might become next. This existential crisis manifested in his physical decline. The tuberculosis was real, a medical condition caused by specific bacteria, but his body's inability to fight it off, the way he seemed to give up and let the disease progress, suggested psychological factors at play. He was dying partly because he had no reason to live, because the world had moved on without him and he couldn't figure out how to move with it. If you're still here with me, still following Black's story through all its complications and contradictions, I'm grateful for your attention. These long-form historical narratives require patience and engagement, and the fact that you're still listening means something. If this story is helping you find that peaceful state between waking and sleeping, that's exactly what it's meant to do. Please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed to Dreamless Timelines yet, now would be a great time. We're building something special here, a place where history comes alive in ways that both inform and soothe. Now, let's continue exploring the broader implications of Black's story and what it reveals about American history and character. The mythology of the Wild West, which emerged even while the frontier was still closing, served specific cultural and political purposes. It provided Americans with a heroic narrative about their expansion across the continent, glossing over uncomfortable truths about violence, exploitation, and indigenous displacement. It created archetypes, the cowboy, the sheriff, the gunfighter, the bounty hunter, that embodied particular values and virtues. Bounty hunters occupied an interesting place in this mythology. They weren't quite heroes like sheriffs or cowboys, but they weren't villains either. They existed in moral gray zones, doing necessary dirty work, embodying both American individualism and its darker implications. They allowed storytellers to explore themes of justice and vengeance, of personal responsibility and social obligation, in ways that more straightforward hero figures couldn't. Black's story, as preserved in Margaret Sullivan's article and later historical works, contributed to this mythology while also complicating it. He wasn't the noble loner of dime novels, motivated by pure justice and always making the right choice. He was damaged, compromised, driven by trauma rather than ideals. Yet he maintained standards and tried to do things right within his limited understanding. This complexity made him more interesting than pure hero or villain archetypes, but also less useful for simple mythological purposes. The academic study of the Wild West emerged in the early 20th century, as historians began seriously examining the frontier period using archival sources and scientific methods. These scholars were interested in separating myth from reality, understanding what frontier life had actually been like rather than what popular culture claimed. Bounty hunting became a subject of serious study as part of this broader historical project. Researchers discovered that most of what popular culture depicted about bounty hunters was wrong or exaggerated. The dramatic gunfights were rare. The noble motivations were mostly absent. The clean distinctions between good guys and bad guys rarely existed in practice. What they found instead was a messy, complicated profession operating in a messy, complicated time, full of moral ambiguity and practical compromise. Black's story became important to this historiography because it was well documented and representative. Margaret Sullivan's article provided contemporary perspective and direct quotes. Court records and wanted posters confirmed his captures. Newspaper accounts mentioned him occasionally. Together, these sources allowed historians to reconstruct his career in unusual detail, making him a valuable case study for understanding bounty hunting generally. Modern historians have used Black's story to explore various themes: the relationship between official and unofficial law enforcement, the psychological impact of frontier violence, the economic motivations behind criminal justice, the transformation of individuals by trauma and profession. His life becomes data, evidence for larger arguments about how frontier society functioned and what it meant. This academic use of Black's story would probably have surprised and maybe amused him. He'd never thought of himself as historically significant, just as a man doing a job. The idea that future scholars would write dissertations and books analyzing his choices and methods would have seemed absurd. Yet that's exactly what happened, his life becoming intellectual property, raw material for historical interpretation and debate. The question of how to memorialize or commemorate bounty hunters remains contested. Some Western towns have embraced bounty hunter history as part of their tourist appeal, creating museums and markers that celebrate these figures. Others have consciously minimized or ignored this aspect of their past, preferring to focus on miners, ranchers, or other less morally complicated pioneers. No one ever erected a monument to Elijah Blackwood. No historical marker indicates where he was buried. No museum displays his weapons or equipment because none survived. His only memorial is textual, the words Margaret Sullivan wrote and the academic works that built on her foundation. For a man who lived such a physical, embodied life, riding thousands of miles and engaging in countless confrontations, this purely written legacy seems inadequate. Yet perhaps it's appropriate. Black lived in the gaps and margins of society, operating in spaces official history didn't quite cover. His story survives in fragments and interpretations, requiring active reconstruction by anyone who wants to understand it. This mirrors how he himself had to reconstruct his identity after losing Mary and the girls, building something new from broken pieces, never quite achieving wholeness again. The comparative study of frontier justice across different American regions reveals interesting variations. Texas bounty hunting differed from Montana bounty hunting, which differed from New Mexico bounty hunting. Local legal traditions, ethnic and racial demographics, economic conditions, and political cultures all shaped how the profession operated in practice. Black worked primarily in the Southwest and lower Midwest, in territories that had been Mexican before being annexed by the United States. This history created specific legal and cultural contexts. Spanish and Mexican legal traditions influenced local practices. Large Hispanic populations meant bilingualism was valuable. Interactions with Native American peoples followed patterns established by both Mexican and American authorities. A bounty hunter working in Montana or Wyoming faced different circumstances. The ethnic composition was different, more recently arrived Europeans and fewer Hispanics. The legal traditions derived more directly from English common law. The climate and terrain created different practical challenges. Native American relationships followed different patterns, shaped by different tribal groups and different histories of conflict. Black's success in his particular region owed partly to his cultural adaptability. He'd learned Spanish, understood Mexican legal concepts that still influenced local practices, developed relationships with Hispanic and Native American communities. A hunter from Montana transplanted to New Mexico might struggle despite having excellent tracking skills, simply because the cultural context was unfamiliar. This regional variation in bounty hunting reflected broader patterns of American development. The United States wasn't uniform or homogeneous, despite nationalist mythology. It was a patchwork of regions with distinct characters, histories, and cultures. Understanding bounty hunting means understanding these regional differences, recognizing that there was no single frontier experience, but rather multiple overlapping and sometimes contradictory experiences. The role of alcohol in frontier life, and specifically in bounty hunting, deserves attention. Whiskey was ubiquitous, serving as social lubricant, medicine, courage, and escape. Many bounty hunters drank heavily, using alcohol to manage stress and trauma, to fit into saloon culture where information flowed, to warm themselves on cold nights in rough camps. Black drank, but generally moderately. He'd seen too many hunters ruined by whiskey, their reflexes slowed, their judgment impaired, their finances destroyed by spending all their money in saloons. He treated alcohol as a tool, something to be used carefully for specific purposes. A drink in a saloon to loosen tongues and hear gossip. A shot of whiskey to warm up after a cold ride. Occasionally, a deliberate drunk to quiet thoughts that wouldn't be quiet otherwise. But he'd watched Lucius Gant's decline, seen how alcohol transformed him from merely unpleasant to actively self-destructive. He'd known other hunters who drank themselves to death, their livers failing, their bodies giving out. The correlation between bounty hunting and alcoholism was strong, though whether the profession drove men to drink or drinking men were attracted to the profession remained unclear. The social rituals around alcohol in frontier towns created both opportunities and dangers for bounty hunters. Saloons were where you gathered information, made contacts, established yourself in a new place. But they were also where fights started, where secrets were revealed, where hunters sometimes got rolled by thieves or set up by criminals. Navigating saloon culture required sobriety and awareness even while appearing relaxed and social. Black had perfected the art of nursing a single drink for hours, staying sober while everyone around him got drunk. He'd order whiskey, take small sips, occasionally refill from his canteen. When no one was looking, so the glass stayed full without him actually consuming much alcohol. This let him participate in saloon socializing while maintaining the mental clarity that kept him alive. The mythology around alcohol in the Old West, like most frontier mythology, is partially accurate and partially invented. Yes, people drank a lot, and yes, saloons were central to social life. But the dramatic barroom brawls and shootouts were relatively rare. Most drinking was social and companionable, people sharing stories and news, establishing relationships and conducting business. Violence happened, but it was the exception rather than the rule. Black had been involved in a few saloon fights over the years, mostly when drunk men picked quarrels with him for reasons that made sense only to them. He'd learned to de-escalate when possible, to walk away from conflicts that didn't serve his purposes. But sometimes walking away wasn't an option, and then he'd fight efficiently and brutally, ending confrontations quickly before they escalated into gunplay. These minor incidents never made it into historical records. They were too common, too unremarkable to generate documentation. But they were part of the texture of bounty hunter life, the daily friction of operating in rough environments among rough men. Managing these small conflicts without letting them blow up into major problems required social intelligence and self-control, qualities as important as tracking ability or gun skills. The economic inequality of frontier society shaped bounty hunting in important ways. Rewards were posted by entities with resources: banks, railroads, mining companies, wealthy individuals. The people being hunted were mostly poor or working class, driven to crime by desperation or lack of legitimate opportunities. This created a system where the wealthy essentially hired freelance enforcers to protect their property and interests against the poor. Black occasionally thought about this dynamic, recognizing that he was serving the interests of people who would never acknowledge him socially, catching criminals who often had sympathetic motives even if their methods were wrong. But he didn't dwell on these thoughts. Economic analysis of systemic injustice wasn't part of his worldview. He saw individual criminals and individual victims, not class structures and power relationships. This limited perspective was typical of bounty hunters and frontier society generally. People thought in terms of personal responsibility and individual morality, not systemic causes. If someone committed crimes, it was because they'd made bad choices, not because society had failed to provide them with better options. This individualistic framework justified the bounty system and made it morally sustainable for the people participating in it. Modern historians have complicated this picture, showing how frontier crime was often driven by structural factors like economic displacement, racial discrimination, and lack of social services. They've revealed how the criminal justice system, including bounty hunting, served to maintain existing power hierarchies and control marginalized populations. This doesn't make individual criminals innocent or bounty hunters guilty, but it adds layers of context that change how we understand the entire system. Black wouldn't have recognized or accepted this historical interpretation. From his perspective, he caught criminals who'd broken laws and hurt people. Their motivations weren't his concern. The systemic factors that might have contributed to their criminality were invisible to him, or at least irrelevant to his work. He operated within a framework that made sense to him, even if that framework obscured larger truths about how society functioned. This tension between individual and systemic perspectives remains relevant today. We still debate whether to focus on personal responsibility or social conditions when addressing crime. We still argue about whether criminal justice should be primarily punitive or rehabilitative. Black's story doesn't resolve these debates, but it shows how they played out in a particular historical context, how people navigated them practically even when they couldn't articulate them theoretically. The religious landscape of the frontier was diverse and complicated, ranging from devout believers to complete skeptics, with most people falling somewhere in between. Bounty hunters, given the nature of their work, tended towards skepticism or at least practical disregard for religious constraints. It was hard to justify hunting humans for money using most religious frameworks. Black had been raised Protestant, attended church regularly before tragedy struck. After losing Mary and the girls, he'd stopped going, stopped praying, stopped thinking about God except as an abstract concept that seemed increasingly irrelevant. He'd occasionally encounter frontier preachers who'd try to save his soul, warning him about eternal consequences of his violent profession. He'd listen politely and move on, neither arguing nor agreeing, simply indifferent. This religious indifference was common among bounty hunters, but not universal. Some maintained strong faith, reconciling their profession with religious belief through various theological gymnastics. They'd argue that they were instruments of divine justice, that God worked through imperfect humans to punish wickedness. These hunters would pray before dangerous confrontations, thank God after successful captures, see their entire career as religious service. Black found this incomprehensible. If God existed and cared about human affairs, why would he need bounty hunters? Why not just strike down the wicked directly? The attempt to clothe mercenary violence in religious garments seemed dishonest, a way to avoid acknowledging what you were really doing. Better to be honest about it, to admit you were hunting men for money, than to pretend you were doing God's work. But he envied those hunters their faith sometimes. They seemed to have purpose and meaning that eluded him. They could see their profession as part of a larger divine plan, which made the violence and isolation more bearable. Black had only pragmatism and habits, thin threads holding him together, barely sufficient to keep him functional. Sister Teresa, the nun who'd cared for him in his final weeks, had tried to talk with him about faith and salvation. She'd been gentle about it, not pushy, recognizing that deathbed conversions couldn't be forced. She'd shared her own story of finding God after a difficult life, how faith had given her peace and purpose. Black had listened with something like wistfulness. He'd wanted to believe, wanted to think that Mary and the girls were somewhere waiting for him, that his suffering had meaning in some cosmic sense. But he couldn't make himself believe just because it would be comforting. The universe seemed indifferent to human hopes and fears, grinding along according to its own logic, unconcerned with individual lives and deaths. "I hope you're right," he told Sister Teresa. "I hope there's something after this, that it all means something. But I can't know, and I can't make myself believe just because I want to." She'd nodded, squeezed his hand. "Faith isn't certainty," she'd said. "It's trust despite uncertainty, but I won't push. You'll find your own way, or you won't. God's grace works in mysterious ways." Black died without finding faith, without experiencing the peaceful acceptance that religious believers described. He died uncertain and afraid, facing the void with only his own worn-out courage to sustain him. Perhaps that was fitting. He'd lived without divine comfort or guidance, relying only on himself. Why should death be different? The question of gender in frontier society, and specifically in bounty hunting, reveals interesting complexities. The West was heavily male-dominated, but women found ways to carve out space and agency, sometimes by conforming to expected roles, sometimes by defying them entirely. Female bounty hunters existed, though they were rare and faced significant additional obstacles. Sarah Bridger, the hunter Black had respected and occasionally worked with, had developed strategies specifically suited to operating as a woman in a male profession. She'd used her gender as camouflage, playing on men's expectations and blind spots, gaining access and trust that male hunters couldn't achieve. But she'd also had to be tougher and more competent than her male counterparts, to prove herself constantly, to overcome skepticism and condescension. Black had witnessed this dynamic firsthand, seeing how other hunters dismissed or underestimated Sarah until she demonstrated her capabilities. Even then, some never fully accepted her as a legitimate professional. They'd attribute her successes to luck or feminine wiles rather than skill and intelligence. This constant need to prove herself must have been exhausting, adding psychological burden to an already difficult profession. Other women participated in bounty hunting indirectly, as informants, guides, or support personnel. Saloon girls and prostitutes often knew more about criminal activity than anyone else in town, having access to secrets that men shared in intimate moments. Smart hunters cultivated these relationships, paying for information, treating these women with respect that society generally denied them. Black had several such informants over the years, women who'd pass along tips about strangers in town, about men bragging about past crimes, about suspicious activities. He'd paid them fairly and never treated them with contempt, recognizing that they were taking risks by helping him. Some male hunters looked down on women who sold sex for money while simultaneously exploiting their knowledge. Black found this hypocrisy distasteful. The broader role of women in frontier society was complex and often contradictory. They were simultaneously idealized as civilizing influences and excluded from power and autonomy. They were expected to be moral guardians while being denied full legal rights. They worked hard, often doing labor that was physically demanding and economically essential, while being portrayed as delicate creatures needing male protection. Bounty hunting threw these contradictions into sharp relief. Women like Sarah proved they could do work supposedly requiring masculine traits like violence, independence, and emotional hardness. Yet they were still judged by feminine standards, criticized for being unwomanly, suspected of moral deficiency simply for choosing this profession. The same qualities that made male hunters respected made female hunters suspect. Black hadn't thought deeply about these gender dynamics, but he'd recognized their existence and tried to treat women fairly within his limited understanding. He'd worked with female hunters when opportunity arose, judged them by their competence rather than their gender, paid female informants appropriately for their assistance. This basic fairness was rare enough in frontier society to be noteworthy, though it shouldn't have been. The environmental impact of frontier settlement, while not something Black or his contemporaries thought about, was substantial and lasting. The buffalo herds were decimated, forests cleared, grasslands overgrazed, rivers diverted and polluted. The frontier that bounty hunters traveled through was already being transformed by human activity, though the scale of that transformation wouldn't become fully apparent until later. Black had witnessed some of these changes during his years of travel. Hunting camps where buffalo had once gathered now stood empty. Streams that had run clear were muddy from upstream mining operations. Trails that had been barely visible paths were widening into roads as wagon traffic increased. The wilderness was shrinking, becoming domesticated, losing its wildness year by year. This environmental transformation paralleled the social transformation that was making bounty hunters obsolete. Both were symptoms of the same larger process, the imposition of order and control on previously uncontrolled space. The wild lands and the wild men who operated in them were both being tamed, brought under management, made safe and predictable. Black felt a kind of melancholy about these changes, though he wouldn't have articulated it in environmental terms. He mourned the loss of open space, of the freedom to travel for days without seeing another human, of the harsh beauty of unsettled country. He recognized that civilization brought benefits, but it also brought constraints and complications he'd been avoiding by staying on the frontier. The Native American perspective on these environmental changes was more acute and more tragic. Indigenous peoples watched their lands being destroyed, their resources being depleted, their entire way of life being made impossible by settlement and development. The buffalo that had sustained plains tribes for centuries were being wiped out systematically, partly for commercial reasons, but partly as deliberate policy to force tribal peoples onto reservations. Bounty hunters occasionally participated in this destruction, either directly by hunting buffalo for hides or indirectly by supporting the settlement systems that drove it. Black had killed buffalo when he needed food, but hadn't engaged in the commercial slaughter that devastated the herds. Still, his presence in the West, his participation in frontier economy, made him complicit in transformations he hadn't intended or desired. This complicity was uncomfortable to contemplate, so mostly he didn't. Like his contemporaries, Black focused on immediate concerns and personal responsibilities, leaving larger questions about environmental and cultural destruction to others. He couldn't stop the tide of settlement and development even if he wanted to, so he didn't spend energy worrying about it. Modern environmental historians have documented these frontier transformations in detail, showing how quickly and thoroughly the West was altered by American expansion. Within a few decades, ecosystems that had existed for millennia were fundamentally changed. Species were driven to extinction or near extinction, indigenous peoples were displaced, and their cultures nearly destroyed. This happened with stunning rapidity, driven by economic incentives and nationalist ideologies that treated the land as resource to be exploited rather than environment to be sustained. Black's story intersects with this environmental history tangentially. He traveled through these changing landscapes, witnessed some of the transformation, participated in the economic and social systems driving it. His career as bounty hunter was made possible by frontier conditions, but also contributed to the ending of those conditions. By helping impose legal order, by removing outlaws who resisted settlement, he facilitated the very civilization that would eventually make his profession obsolete. The irony probably wouldn't have been lost on him if he'd thought about it. He'd built his life around frontier conditions while simultaneously working to end those conditions. He was an agent of transformation that would ultimately eliminate his own role. But irony requires distance and perspective, qualities difficult to maintain when you're living through changes rather than studying them from afar. The health conditions of frontier life were harsh and often fatal. Medical care was minimal and unreliable. Diseases that would be minor inconveniences today could kill in the frontier context. Injuries that would heal cleanly with modern treatment could become infected and gangrenous. Life expectancy was significantly shorter than in more settled areas, especially for people engaged in dangerous professions like bounty hunting. Black had stayed relatively healthy through most of his career, partly through luck and partly through care. He'd avoided major injuries, had never been shot despite numerous confrontations, had managed to stay ahead of the infectious diseases that periodically swept through frontier towns. The tuberculosis that finally killed him had probably been developing for years, his damaged lungs gradually losing capacity until they could no longer sustain him. Other bounty hunters weren't so lucky. Thomas Garrett had died from gunshot wounds, probably preventable if he'd had access to modern surgical care. Others had succumbed to pneumonia, influenza, dysentery, cholera, infections from minor cuts that spread and overwhelmed their systems. The frontier consumed bodies ruthlessly, indifferent to skill or experience or determination. This constant proximity to death shaped frontier culture in profound ways. People lived with awareness that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, that a minor injury or illness could escalate rapidly into something fatal. This created a certain fatalism, a sense that you couldn't control much beyond your immediate actions, that larger forces of chance and circumstance determined outcomes. Black embodied this fatalism in his approach to life and work. He did what he could to stay alive and succeed, but he recognized that ultimately he couldn't control everything. A bullet might find him despite his precautions. A disease might take him despite his health. The universe was indifferent to his plans and hopes. All you could do was keep moving, keep working, keep surviving as long as possible. This fatalistic outlook is often misunderstood as bravery or courage. People see frontier figures facing danger without apparent fear and interpret this as heroism. But often it was just acceptance, recognition that fear didn't change anything, that danger existed whether you worried about it or not. Better to focus on what you could control than to waste energy on what you couldn't. Black wasn't brave in the conventional sense. He was simply realistic about odds and outcomes, willing to take calculated risks when they served his purposes, unwilling to let fear paralyze him into inaction. This pragmatic approach to danger served him well professionally, but also reflected the emotional numbing that had overtaken him after losing his family. If you don't value your own life highly, facing death becomes easier. The legacy of bounty hunting in American legal culture extends beyond the specific profession into broader questions about private enforcement and individual rights. The legal principle that private citizens can pursue and apprehend fugitives, while regulated, still exists in American law. Bail bondsmen and their agents operate under authority derived from the bounty hunting tradition. This persistence reflects deep-seated American attitudes about individual responsibility and limited government. Americans have historically been suspicious of centralized authority and supportive of private initiative, even in areas like law enforcement that most societies reserve for state monopoly. The bounty hunting tradition embodies these attitudes, showing both their practical utility and their potential for abuse. Courts have wrestled with bounty hunting's legal status for over a century, issuing contradictory rulings that reflect ambivalence about the practice. Some decisions have granted bounty hunters broad authority, treating them almost as private law enforcement. Others have imposed strict limits, emphasizing that bounty hunters are private citizens with limited powers. The inconsistency suggests unresolved tension about where to draw lines between private and public enforcement. Black operated in a time when these legal boundaries were even less clear than today. He had considerable practical authority but little official standing. He could track fugitives across jurisdictional boundaries, detain them, use force as necessary, all without a badge or official commission. This power came from the economic logic of the bounty system rather than from formal legal authority. Modern bounty hunters, or fugitive recovery agents as they're often called now, work within more developed legal frameworks. They need licenses in most states, must follow specific procedures, face civil liability for misconduct. The profession has been domesticated, made safer and more predictable, stripped of much of its frontier wildness. Whether this represents progress or loss depends on your perspective. The educational role that stories like Black's play in contemporary America is worth considering. We use frontier narratives to teach about American history and character, to explore themes of justice and violence, to think about how societies handle crime and disorder. These stories become pedagogical tools, ways of transmitting values and provoking thought about complex issues. Black's story is particularly useful for this purpose because it resists simple interpretations. Students can't easily categorize him as hero or villain, can't reduce his choices to moral absolutes. They have to wrestle with complexity and ambiguity, with the reality that good people sometimes do bad things for complicated reasons, that systems can be simultaneously necessary and unjust. This kind of historical thinking, comfortable with ambiguity and contradiction, is valuable beyond the specific content being taught. It trains minds to see nuance, to recognize that most important questions don't have simple answers, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. These are crucial skills for citizenship and personal life, though they're often underdeveloped in educational systems that prefer clear-cut lessons and moral certainties. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration of Elijah Blackwood's life and the world of frontier bounty hunting, I want to thank you sincerely. This has been a long journey through complicated history, and your attention means everything. Please take a moment to like this video if it's been helpful in your quest for peaceful sleep, and leave a comment sharing what aspects of Black's story resonated with you. Subscribe to Dreamless Timelines if you haven't already. We are creating a library of these deep historical narratives, each one designed to inform your mind while calming it toward rest. Now, let's bring Black's story to its final conclusion and reflect on what it all means. The unmarked grave where Elijah Blackwood was buried in Kansas City still exists, though no one knows exactly where. The cemetery has been reorganized several times over the decades, markers moved or lost, records consolidated or discarded. Somewhere in that ground, Black's bones rest among hundreds of others, anonymous and forgotten except in historical records. This anonymity seems appropriate. Black had lived on the margins of society, neither fully inside nor outside, operating in grey areas that official history struggled to document. His grave's anonymity mirrors his life's ambiguity, the way he existed between categories, neither hero nor villain, neither lawman nor outlaw, neither fully alive nor completely dead even before his physical death. The few people who remembered him personally all died within 20 years of his death. Margaret Sullivan passed away in 1899, having written extensively about the closing frontier and its characters. The lawmen he'd worked with retired or died. The criminals he'd captured either served their sentences and disappeared into obscurity or were executed and buried in prison graveyards. By 1900, no one who'd known Black personally remained alive. Yet his story persisted in textual form, preserved in Sullivan's article and the historical works that built on it. Each generation of historians rediscovered him, using his career to illustrate different arguments about frontier justice. Some emphasized his restraint and professionalism, presenting him as an example of how private enforcement could work responsibly. Others focused on his violence and emotional damage, using him to critique the bounty system's human costs. These scholarly interpretations shaped how subsequent generations understood both Black specifically and bounty hunting generally. Students reading about the Wild West encountered his name in textbooks and articles. Fiction writers used him as inspiration for characters, though usually simplifying or exaggerating aspects of his story to fit narrative needs. His life became public property, raw material for endless interpretation and reimagining. The broader transformation of American society that Black witnessed accelerating in his final years continued after his death. The frontier officially closed in 1890 according to the Census Bureau, which declared that continuous stretches of unsettled land no longer existed. This proclamation didn't end all frontier conditions immediately, but it marked a symbolic turning point, recognition that an era had finished. The bounty hunters who survived this transition adapted in various ways. Some became private detectives, using their tracking and investigation skills in urban contexts. Others joined official law enforcement, bringing frontier expertise to increasingly professionalized police forces. A few continued working in the shrinking spaces where traditional bounty hunting remained possible, chasing fugitives in remote areas that hadn't yet been fully incorporated into modern legal systems. The profession's transformation reflected broader Americanization processes. The chaos and improvisation of frontier life gave way to organization and regulation. Informal social arrangements were replaced by formal institutions. Personal relationships yielded to bureaucratic structures. This wasn't necessarily progress in any simple sense, more a shift from one set of problems and possibilities to another. Black's story captures this transitional moment, showing someone caught between disappearing frontier and emerging modern America, comfortable in neither world, belonging fully to neither. His death in 1882 spared him from having to navigate the full transition, from having to find place in a world that no longer needed or wanted men like him. He died when he was still relevant, before complete obsolescence set in. The fear that bounty hunters inspired gradually faded as the profession evolved and frontier conditions disappeared. Modern Americans don't generally fear bounty hunters or their descendants the way frontier citizens did. The specific historical conditions that made bounty hunters terrifying, their near-unlimited authority, their willingness to use violence, their relentless pursuit across vast territories, no longer exist. Yet echoes of that fear remain in how Americans think about private enforcement and individual violence. We're still uncomfortable with vigilantism, still worried about power without accountability, still debating where to draw lines between self-defense and aggression. The bounty hunters are gone, but the questions they raised remain relevant. Black's legacy, to the extent he has won, lies in this questioning rather than in any specific answers. His story provokes thought about justice and violence, about trauma and transformation, about what we become when circumstances push us beyond familiar limits. These aren't questions with definitive answers, but they're questions worth asking, worth sitting with, worth letting shape how we understand ourselves and our society. As the night deepens and your mind settles into the rhythms of approaching sleep, let Black's story fade into the background of your consciousness. Let it become part of the tapestry of history that surrounds and informs us, present but not insistent, significant but not overwhelming. He was one man who lived in difficult times, making choices that seemed necessary or inevitable, leaving behind a complicated legacy that resists simple interpretation. The Wild West that Black inhabited exists now only in memory and imagination, in historical records and cultural narratives, in stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we've become. It was never as simple as the myths suggest, never as purely heroic or as completely lawless. It was complicated and contradictory, full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things for complicated reasons, building a society while struggling with its implications. Bounty hunters like Black were part of that complex reality. They weren't characters in a moral fable, but real humans navigating impossible situations, trying to survive and find purpose in a chaotic world. Their fear-inspiring reputation came from their effectiveness and their ambiguity, from the way they embodied both order and violence, both justice and vengeance. Understanding them requires holding these contradictions without resolving them, recognizing that history doesn't offer clear lessons or simple heroes. It offers instead complicated stories of complicated people, doing what they believed they had to do, creating consequences they couldn't always foresee, leaving legacies they couldn't control. Elijah Blackwood tracked outlaws across the frontier for over a decade, brought dozens to justice, earned and lost a fortune, damaged himself in ways that proved irreparable. He died alone in a charity hospital, his body broken, his spirit exhausted, his life's meaning uncertain. He left behind no family, no fortune, no monument, just a story preserved in fragments, interpreted and reinterpreted by generations trying to understand what the frontier was and what it meant. That story has traveled down through the years to reach you tonight, here in the 21st century, as you lie in bed seeking rest and perhaps a little understanding. It's a story about loss and adaptation, about violence and restraint, about the costs of survival in harsh times. It's a story that asks more questions than it answers, that complicates rather than simplifies, that refuses to be reduced to moral lessons or heroic archetypes. As you drift towards sleep, let Black's story settle into that space between waking thought and dreaming consciousness. Let it be one thread in the larger fabric of human experience, one example of how people navigate difficulty and create meaning in meaningless circumstances. He was neither savior nor villain, neither completely admirable nor wholly contemptible. He was human, complicated and flawed, trying his best with the understanding and resources he had. The frontier is closed, the bounty hunters are gone. The specific world that Black inhabited has vanished into history, but the questions his life raises about justice and violence, about trauma and transformation, about what we become when pushed beyond our limits, these questions remain with us. They're woven into American culture and character, shaping how we think about ourselves and our society in ways we don't always recognize. So rest now, having traveled with me through this long exploration of forgotten history. Let your mind quiet, your body relax, your consciousness drift toward the peace of sleep. Black's story has been told, the bounty hunters have been remembered, the fear they inspired has been explained and contextualized. You can let it all go now, secure in the knowledge that you've learned something, that you've engaged with history in its full complexity, that you've honored these forgotten figures by paying attention to their stories. Sleep well, and may your dreams be gentler than the nightmares that haunted Elijah Blackwood in his final days. May you wake refreshed, carrying perhaps some small insight from this long night's journey through frontier history. And may you remember that every life, even those lived in violence and isolation, has value and significance, teaches us something about the human condition, deserves to be told and heard. The story is finished. Black has found his rest at last, and now it's time for you to find yours. Good night, and thank you for listening. The end. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the forgotten history of Wild West bounty hunters. If this story helped you find peaceful sleep, please give it a like and subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more historically accurate, sleep-inducing narratives from America's past. Leave a comment below sharing which part of Black's story affected you most. I read every comment and use your feedback to shape future episodes. Until next time, sleep well and dream deep.